Some vanish into the sea, others into the sky. Some walk down a road and are never seen again. And some disappear not only from the world but from history itself. Tonight, we step into the stories of those who left behind only fragments, questions without answers, trails without endings. From lost explorers to missing artists, from unsolved crimes to legends that blur truth and myth, these are the disappearances that continue to haunt our imagination. And if you want to keep walking deeper into the unknown with us, make sure to subscribe, because the next mystery is already waiting.
The vanishing of Barbara Newhall Follett. It begins with a girl who seemed destined to rewrite literature itself. A child prodigy, a novelist at 12, and a voice that critics compared to the masters of her age. But then, one cold December night in 1939, Barbara Newhall Follett walked out of her apartment with just $30 in her pocket, and vanished. Her disappearance remains one of the most haunting literary mysteries of the 20th century. Early brilliance. Barbara Newhall Follett was born in Hanover, New Hampshire, in March of 1914. From her earliest years, she displayed an unusual talent for words. Her father, Wilson Follett, was a respected literary critic and editor. Her mother, Helen, was a writer as well. Surrounded by books, Barbara absorbed language in a way that seemed almost supernatural. By the age of 4, she was already crafting her own poems. At 8, she began writing The House Without Windows, a lyrical fantasy about a girl who escapes into the wilderness. She completed it at just 12 years old. When the novel was published in 1927, the literary world was stunned. Critics praised its poetic style and astonishing maturity. One reviewer described it as a strange and beautiful book, written by a child with the vision of a poet. Barbara was hailed as a prodigy, perhaps even a genius. But with fame came pressure. The young author was thrust into interviews, book signings, and constant praise. To many, it looked like the beginning of a brilliant literary career. Yet in hindsight, it may have been the beginning of something else entirely, the slow unraveling of a gifted mind caught between imagination and reality. A life in motion. Barbara's childhood was far from stable. Her parents' marriage began to fracture, and financial troubles cast shadows over their lives. The family moved often, and when her father abandoned them in 1928, the world Barbara knew collapsed. Despite the turmoil, she pressed on. She continued to write, creating manuscripts that revealed a growing depth and complexity. She loved adventure, travel, and the outdoors. Sailing became one of her passions. She worked on yachts, traveled the Caribbean, and absorbed every detail of the world around her. But the glow of her early fame dimmed. Publishers were hesitant. Manuscripts went unfinished. She struggled to maintain the momentum that had once seemed unstoppable. In a letter, Barbara confided that she felt lost, torn between her love of freedom and the weight of expectation. By her mid-20s, she had settled into a quieter life. She married a man named Nickerson Rogers and lived with him in Brookline, Massachusetts. Outwardly, it seemed ordinary. But something beneath the surface was changing. Cracks in the foundation letters from this time reveal a woman restless, even disillusioned. Barbara described herself as feeling trapped, disconnected from her writing, and uncertain of her future. Her marriage to Rogers was troubled. Friends later reported tension between them, arguments, and long periods of unhappiness. Barbara's spirit, once so full of creative energy, seemed dimmed. Yet, even in despair, she clung to her identity as a writer. In 1933, she wrote to a friend, "When I have energy enough to write, it's the only thing that can make me happy. But energy is rare. Something has gone out of me." The words echo like a premonition. The disappearance. On the evening of December 7, 1939, Barbara Newhall Follett walked out of her apartment in Brookline. She carried $30, left behind no note, and vanished into the night. Her husband, Rogers, did not immediately report her missing. Days passed. Weeks. Finally, a police report was filed. Investigators searched the area, questioned neighbors, and followed leads. But Barbara was gone. There were no signs of foul play. no body was ever found. The trail ended as suddenly as it began. For a time, newspapers covered the story, highlighting the eerie irony: a once celebrated writer of wilderness fantasies had disappeared into the unknown. But as months turned into years, the case faded from public memory. Theories and speculation: what happened to Barbara? Some believe she chose to disappear, that she walked away from her failing marriage, her lost career, and the weight of her early fame. With her adventurous spirit, perhaps she built a new life under another name, vanishing deliberately to escape the shadows of expectation. Others suggest she may have taken her own life. Letters written in the years before her disappearance reveal depression and exhaustion. Her world, once vivid, had grown dim. On a winter night, despair may have led her to a final decision. There is also the possibility of foul play. Some historians have speculated that her troubled marriage may have concealed darker truths. With no body, no evidence, and no witnesses, certainty remains out of reach. Each theory leaves gaps. Each explanation feels incomplete. The silence around her fate is almost louder than any conclusion. A lost legacy. What makes Barbara's story so haunting is not only her disappearance but the brilliance she left behind. The House Without Windows is still read today, not just as the work of a prodigy but as a window into the mind of a girl who seemed connected to the wild, untamed forces of life itself. Her later manuscripts, fragments of novels, poems, and letters, reveal flashes of genius that never had the chance to fully blossom. Her voice, once celebrated, was cut off too soon. The world lost Barbara twice. First, when her career faltered. And then, when she stepped into the night and never returned. Reflections. Barbara Newhall Follett's disappearance remains unsolved. There are no definitive answers, no closure for her family, and no trace for historians to examine. What we are left with are her words, fragments of a mind that saw the world with wonder, even as her own life darkened. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions: what becomes of brilliance when the world cannot nurture it? How much of her disappearance was choice, and how much was fate? In the end, Barbara remains suspended between presence and absence, remembered only in ink and mystery. And perhaps that is fitting. For a writer who once dreamed of escaping into the wilderness, she succeeded in creating the greatest mystery of all, her own. The mystery of Lucy Blackman. It begins with a phone call that no parent ever wants to receive. A daughter, full of life and youth, suddenly gone. Her name was Lucy Blackman, a 21-year-old from England who vanished in Tokyo during the summer of 2000. What followed was a story of culture, crime, and the dangerous shadows hidden within one of the world's safest cities. A New Life in Tokyo. Lucy May Blackman was born in 1978 in Sevenoaks, Kent, England. By all accounts, she was bright, outgoing, and adventurous. Standing over 6 feet tall with blonde hair, she was striking in appearance, and her friends remembered her as someone who lit up any room. In May 2000, she and her close friend Louise Phillips traveled to Japan. Both young women had previously worked as flight attendants for British Airways, but they were looking for a new experience, an adventure abroad where they could earn money and explore a different culture. Tokyo seemed ideal. It was modern, bustling, and, in many ways, considered one of the safest capitals in the world. To make ends meet, the women took jobs as hostesses in the Roppongi district, an area famous for its nightlife. For many foreigners, hostessing was not unusual. The role involved sitting with men in bars, pouring drinks, engaging in conversation, and making them feel welcome. There was no requirement for sexual activity, though the environment could sometimes blur boundaries. For Lucy, it seemed like a temporary way to pay her bills while enjoying Tokyo's vibrant culture. But just 2 months after arriving, her adventure took a sinister turn. The last call on July 1, 2000, Lucy told Louise that she had been invited out by a wealthy businessman she had met at the club. He had promised to take her on a drive along the coast. Lucy seemed excited but also mentioned that she would call later to check in. That evening, Louise received a brief message. Lucy phoned to say, "I'll be back in an hour." But she never returned. When Louise tried calling again, there was no answer. Panic set in quickly. Within hours, friends were searching, and soon after, Lucy's disappearance was reported to both local authorities and the British Embassy. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. A family's nightmare back in England, the Blackman family was devastated. Lucy's father, Tim Blackman, flew to Tokyo to search for his daughter. With the media watching closely, he pleaded for information, holding up photographs and begging anyone with knowledge to come forward. At first, the Japanese police were slow to react. Missing person cases, particularly involving foreigners, were often treated with less urgency. But as public pressure mounted, and as the British government pressed for answers, the investigation expanded. Tim Blackman's presence kept the case in the spotlight. His grief, visible in interviews, resonated with people worldwide. Yet weeks turned into months, and still, there was no sign of Lucy. The investigation detectives soon uncovered disturbing details. Other foreign hostesses reported that a man had lured them out of bars with promises of luxury, then taken them to apartments where they had been drugged and assaulted. One name surfaced repeatedly: Joji Obara. Obara was a wealthy Japanese businessman of Korean descent. He lived an eccentric, isolated life, collecting luxury cars and maintaining expensive properties. He was also a predator. Police later discovered that he had meticulously documented his crimes, keeping detailed records and even video footage of the women he drugged. Obara denied knowing Lucy. But his reputation and history made him the prime suspect. Discovery for months, the Blackman family endured uncertainty. Then, in February 2001, 7 months after her disappearance, search teams discovered a cave near the coastal town of Miura, southwest of Tokyo. Inside was the dismembered and decomposed body of a young woman, sealed in a concrete block. Dental records confirmed the worst. It was Lucy Blackman. The brutality of the discovery shocked even seasoned investigators. The cave was remote, suggesting deliberate concealment. Whoever had placed her there had taken steps to ensure she would not be found. The Blackmans' search for hope ended in unimaginable grief. Trial and justice attention quickly turned back to Joji Obara. In 2001, he was arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual assault against other women, as well as the abduction and death of Lucy Blackman. The trial, however, dragged on for years. Japanese courts are known for their cautious and meticulous approach, and Obara faced dozens of charges involving different victims. In 2007, after a lengthy trial, Obara was convicted of multiple rapes and the death of another woman, an Australian named Carita Ridgway. But in a shocking twist, he was acquitted of charges related to Lucy Blackman's death due to insufficient direct evidence. For the Blackman family, it was a crushing blow. They had endured 7 years of waiting only to see justice slip through their fingers. But the story did not end there. In 2008, an appeals court reversed part of the decision. Obara was found guilty of abducting, dismembering, and abandoning Lucy's body. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Though the conviction brought some measure of justice, the full truth of what happened to Lucy on that night in July 2000 was never fully revealed. Legacy: the case of Lucy Blackman reverberated far beyond Tokyo. It exposed the vulnerabilities of young foreign women working in nightlife districts, and it raised troubling questions about how crimes against them were investigated. In Britain, the case prompted debate about how to protect citizens abroad. In Japan, it highlighted the darker side of a culture often seen as safe and orderly. Lucy's father, Tim Blackman, became an outspoken advocate for the families of crime victims. He campaigned for greater support and awareness, ensuring that Lucy's story was not forgotten. Her death also inspired books, documentaries, and widespread media coverage. To this day, her name is remembered as a symbol of innocence lost, and of a mystery that, even with a conviction, never feels completely solved. Reflections: the story of Lucy Blackman is not just about one woman's disappearance. It is about the intersection of vulnerability and power, of hidden violence in places that appear safe, and of the long shadows cast by grief. Lucy was 21 years old, exploring the world, chasing independence, and stepping into adulthood. She could not have known that a single decision, to accept a drive from a wealthy man, would end her life. Her story remains a warning, a tragedy, and a mystery. For even though the courts delivered a sentence, the full details of what happened that night remain locked away, perhaps only ever known by Lucy, and the man who silenced her voice. And that silence, like the cave where she was found, continues to echo. The disappearance of Raymond Robbins. It begins not on a battlefield or in a darkened alley, but in the heart of Washington, D.C., during one of the most turbulent decades of American history. The man at the center of it was Raymond Robbins, a reformer, a political figure, and a man who moved in the highest circles of power. In September 1932, Robbins walked out of his Washington home, and vanished. For months, no one knew whether he was dead, hiding, or caught in forces larger than himself. The disappearance of Raymond Robbins remains one of the strangest political mysteries of the Depression era. A rising figure in reform, Raymond Robbins was born in 1873 in Florida. His early life was troubled. He spent part of his youth working in mines and traveling aimlessly. But eventually, he transformed himself into a lawyer, a social reformer, and a man deeply drawn to progressive causes. In Chicago, he became known for his work in settlement houses, community centers that served poor and immigrant families. He was charismatic, ambitious, and driven by a desire to change society. By the early 20th century, Robbins had entered politics. He became a leader in the Progressive Party, supporting Theodore Roosevelt's 1912 campaign. Later, he advised government officials on labor relations and industrial reforms. But his influence extended far beyond domestic policy. The Russian connection. In 1917, Robbins traveled to Russia as head of the American Red Cross mission. He arrived in Petrograd during one of the most volatile periods in modern history, the Russian Revolution. There, he met directly with Bolshevik leaders, including Lenin and Trotsky. While the United States was wary of the revolution, Robbins believed in dialogue. He urged the U.S. government to recognize the new Soviet regime, convinced that it represented a lasting shift in global politics. This position made him controversial back home. To some, he was a visionary willing to engage with change. To others, he was dangerously sympathetic to radicals. The Russian experience marked him deeply. Though he returned to America, he remained an enigmatic figure, one who carried both political connections and political enemies. The Washington years. By the late 1920s, Robbins was living in Washington, D.C. He moved in elite circles, socialized with senators and cabinet members, and advised on issues of diplomacy and social reform. But behind the public figure, there was a man wrestling with inner conflicts. Friends described him as intense, sometimes erratic, and often restless. He was known to take long walks at night, disappearing for hours into the city. It was this restlessness that would one day take him beyond the reach of anyone who knew him. The disappearance on September 3, 1932, Raymond Robbins left his home in Washington, D.C. He carried little with him, and he did not say where he was going. He never returned. At first, those close to him assumed he might be on one of his long walks. But when hours became days, and days became weeks, worry grew. Newspapers reported the mystery: a prominent reformer and former diplomat had simply vanished. Rumors spread quickly. Some speculated he had been abducted because of his political views. Others whispered that he had staged his disappearance intentionally. Still others feared he had met with foul play in a city where politics often blurred with conspiracy. The missing person case of Raymond Robbins became national news. Police scoured the city. His friends appealed to the public for leads. Even President Herbert Hoover reportedly took an interest, given Robbins' past political influence. But no clear trail emerged. There was no body, no letter, no evidence of violence. It was as if he had dissolved into the city air. Months dragged on. Theories multiplied. Some claimed he had fled to Europe. Others thought he had gone into hiding due to private troubles. Then, in the summer of 1933, nearly a year after his disappearance, Robbins reappeared. A return from nowhere. Robbins was found living quietly in Asheville, North Carolina. He claimed he had suffered a nervous breakdown and had withdrawn from public life. The explanation was simple, perhaps too simple. He said he had wandered, confused, needing distance from the pressures of politics and the turmoil of his own mind. He apologized to friends and family but offered few details. For some, this closed the case. For others, it deepened the mystery. Why would a man so deeply tied to global affairs and national politics simply vanish for a year without a trace? What had he seen, or known, that drove him to such extremes? Interpretations. Historians have offered many interpretations of Robbins' disappearance. One theory is purely medical: he suffered from a genuine mental collapse. The stress of his years in Russia, his political controversies, and the weight of the Depression era may have combined into a breakdown. Another theory is political, that Robbins knew too much about American dealings with the Soviet Union, and his disappearance was encouraged, or at least welcomed, by those in power. A third possibility is more personal. Robbins may have simply chosen to escape. His life had been full of intensity, causes, and conflict. Perhaps he sought solitude, anonymity, and peace. Yet none of these explanations fully satisfy the strangeness of the case. Later life. After his reappearance, Robbins lived more quietly. He continued to speak on social issues but never regained the prominence he once had. His health declined, and he spent much of his later years in Florida, away from the political spotlight. He died in 1954 at the age of 81. By then, his disappearance had faded into a historical footnote, but for those who remembered, it was a mystery never fully solved. Reflections. The story of Raymond Robbins is more than just a tale of a missing man. It is a window into a turbulent era when politics, ideology, and personal struggle collided. He was a man who stood at the crossroads of history: progressive reform in America, revolution in Russia, and depression at home. Yet his most enduring legacy may not be his speeches or his politics, but the year he disappeared, a blank page in the life of a man who once stood so close to power. And perhaps that blank page is what makes his story endure. For in mystery, we find questions that history cannot answer. What drove Raymond Robbins into the shadows? Exhaustion? Conspiracy? Or a desire to escape the weight of a world he could no longer bear? We will never know. And that silence, that unanswered space, is what keeps his disappearance alive in memory. Script: The Vanishing of Everett Roos. It begins with a young man, a pack on his back, and the desert stretching endlessly before him. His name was Everett Roos. In the 1930s, he wandered the American Southwest, writing, painting, and carving his thoughts into stone. Then, in November 1934, he disappeared. No body was ever found. No final letter explained his fate. And to this day, the desert still keeps its secret. A spirit of the wild. Everett Roos was born in 1914 in Oakland, California. From an early age, he was restless. He loved poetry, art, and solitude. His parents described him as independent, even rebellious. By his teenage years, Everett was already drawn to wilderness. He hiked the Sierra Nevada, camped in Yosemite, and spent long stretches of time alone, sketching and journaling. His words often revealed a longing for freedom, and a dissatisfaction with modern life. In 1931, at the age of 17, he set out on his first solo journey through the Southwest. He carried only the basics: a bedroll, a few supplies, his burros, and his notebooks. His letters home described landscapes with almost spiritual intensity. He wrote of red rock cathedrals, the silence of canyons, and the feeling of becoming part of something eternal. To Everett, the wilderness was not just scenery, it was a calling. The wandering years between 1931 and 1934, Everett wandered thousands of miles through Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico. He immersed himself in Navajo and Hopi communities, studied petroglyphs, and sometimes lived for weeks without seeing another person. Everywhere he went, he left behind traces of his journey, woodblock prints, sketches, and carvings. On canyon walls, he sometimes etched his name, followed by the word Nemo. Nemo, Latin for nobody. A signature that suggested both anonymity and defiance. His letters, later published in collections, captured the duality of his soul, the joy of freedom and the melancholy of isolation. One passage read, "I have always been unsatisfied with life as most people live it. Always I want to live more intensely and richly." But even as his words inspired others, they foreshadowed the risks of such a solitary path. The final journey in the summer of 1934, Everett Roos left Escalante, Utah, heading into the Escalante Canyons and the remote Kuiperowitz Plateau. He was last seen in early November by cattlemen near Davis Gulch, a rugged tributary of the Escalante River. He had 2 burros, enough supplies for several weeks, and the same quiet determination that had marked all his journeys. Then, silence. When weeks passed without word, his family grew alarmed. By December, search parties set out across the Utah desert. The search for Everett was extensive. Cowboys, local residents, and even the Civilian Conservation Corps scoured the canyons. They found his burros. They were in a corral at Davis Gulch, healthy but unattended. His camp had been abandoned. There were no clear signs of struggle, no body, and no final note. Tracks suggested he had explored side canyons. But beyond that, the trail vanished. For his parents, it was agony. They clung to the hope that Everett was still alive, perhaps living with native communities, or wandering deeper into the wilderness. But as the months dragged on, hope gave way to mystery. Theories of his fate over the decades, countless theories have surfaced about what happened to Everett Roos. 1. Accident. The most straightforward explanation is that Everett fell while climbing or drowned while crossing the river. The Escalante Canyons are unforgiving, steep cliffs, flash floods, and hidden dangers at every turn. Without modern rescue equipment, a single misstep could have ended his life, leaving his body hidden in inaccessible terrain. 2. Murder. Some locals believed he may have been killed, perhaps robbed by rustlers or drifters. Stories circulated of Navajo or Ute raiders, though no evidence supported these claims. In 2009, bones were discovered near Combe Ridge that some believed belonged to Everett, but DNA tests later disproved the connection. 3. Chose to disappear. Others suggest Everett staged his own disappearance. The word Nemo, carved into stone, hinted at his desire to dissolve into anonymity. Perhaps he abandoned his animals and possessions to begin a new life, somewhere no one would find him. 4. Integration with native tribes. There are oral traditions among the Navajo that speak of a tall, white stranger who lived briefly among them. Could Everett have found a new identity in the desert communities he admired so much? Each theory adds possibility, but none brings certainty. The legend of Everett Roos. What makes his story endure is not only the mystery of his disappearance but the legacy of his words. After his vanishing, his parents published his journals and letters under the title On Desert Trails with Everett Roos. Readers were struck by the depth of his reflections and the beauty of his descriptions. In time, Everett became a symbol, the romantic wanderer, the desert poet who chose wilderness over society. Writers and historians have compared him to John Muir, Edward Abbey, and even Christopher McCandless of Into the Wild fame. But unlike those men, Everett's story remains unfinished. His last chapter was never written. The silence of the desert. Standing in Davis Gulch today, one sees the same walls of Navajo sandstone, the same river winding through narrow slots, the same silence that Everett once described. Somewhere in these canyons, the answer to his fate may still lie. A lost grave. A hidden crevice. Or perhaps nothing at all, only the emptiness of the desert. His last carved signature, Nemo 1934, remains etched into stone. A final reminder of a man who both belonged everywhere and nowhere. Reflections. The story of Everett Roos is as much about the questions he left behind as it is about the life he lived. Was he a victim of accident, crime, or his own restless desire to disappear? Did he die quickly in the wilderness he loved, or did he find a way to escape into a new identity? The desert does not answer. It holds its secrets with silence. And maybe that is fitting. For Everett himself once wrote, "Say that I starved, that I was lost and weary, that I was burned and blinded by the desert sun, footsore, thirsty, sick with strange diseases, lonely and wet and cold, but that I kept my dream." His dream was freedom. His fate was mystery. And together, they have made his story eternal. The disappearance of Bison Dele. It begins not on the basketball court, but far from it, in the endless blue of the Pacific Ocean. The man was Bison Dele, once an NBA champion, a center with a commanding presence, and a man who walked away from fame to live freely. In July 2002, he set sail from Tahiti. He was never seen again. What happened on that voyage remains one of the darkest mysteries in the history of sports. From Brian Williams to Bison Dele. Bison Dele was born Brian Carson Williams on April 6, 1969, in Fresno, California. His father, Eugene Williams, was a member of the legendary Motown group The Platters. His childhood was not always easy. His parents divorced, and young Brian wrestled with identity and restlessness. Athletics gave him focus. He grew tall, strong, and skilled. At the University of Arizona, he stood out on the court as a talented center. By 1991, he was drafted into the NBA by the Orlando Magic. His professional career took him through the Denver Nuggets, Los Angeles Clippers, Chicago Bulls, and finally the Detroit Pistons. At his peak, he won an NBA championship in 1997 with Michael Jordan's Bulls. But unlike many athletes, basketball was never the center of his life. He loved music, art, and adventure. In 1998, at just 30 years old, he stunned the league by retiring early. He left behind millions of dollars in potential earnings, choosing instead to travel the world on his own terms. He changed his name to Bison Dele, honoring his Cherokee and African heritage. For him, life had always been about more than basketball. A life of freedom. After retirement, Dele embraced freedom. He traveled to Lebanon, the Mediterranean, and the South Pacific. He learned to sail, bought a boat, and explored remote islands. Friends described him as restless but charismatic, someone always searching for a deeper experience of life. In 2002, Dele was living largely in Tahiti. He owned a catamaran named the Hakuna Matata, a symbol of his love for the open sea. But his lifestyle also put him in the company of people he didn't always trust. And among them was his older brother, Miles Dabord. The voyage on July 6, 2002, Bison Dele, his girlfriend Serena Carlin, his brother Miles Dabord, and the boat's captain Bertrand Saldo set sail from the island of Moorea, just off Tahiti. It was supposed to be a short trip. But when days passed without word, concern grew. By late July, the Hakuna Matata was spotted in Tahiti, but something was wrong. Only Miles Dabord was aboard. Bison, Serena, and Captain Saldo were gone. The suspicions authorities quickly grew suspicious. Miles gave conflicting explanations. At one point, he claimed the others had stayed on a different island. Another time, he suggested an accident had occurred. The truth unraveled when Dabord sailed the Hakuna Matata to Tahiti and then attempted to forge Bison's signature in Phoenix, Arizona, to buy gold using Bison's identity. The transaction raised alarms, and investigators connected him to the disappearance. The evidence suggested something chilling, that during the voyage, Miles had killed his brother, Serena Carlin, and Captain Saldo, and then tried to cover his tracks. The tragic spiral of Miles Dabord, born Kevin Williams, had always lived in the shadow of his younger brother. He was taller, darker-skinned, and struggled with comparisons. While Bison thrived in basketball and later in adventure, Miles wrestled with personal troubles and instability. Their relationship was complicated, close at times, resentful at others. For Miles, being on that voyage may have been both reconciliation and rivalry. By September 2002, police were closing in. But before he could be fully questioned, Miles overdosed on insulin in a suicide attempt. He fell into a coma in Tijuana, Mexico, and died shortly after. With his death, the only living witness to what happened on that boat was gone. What happened at sea? Without testimony, the events of July 6, 2002, remain unclear. Investigators pieced together fragments of evidence, but the Pacific kept its silence. The most accepted theory is grim. At some point on the voyage, a violent argument broke out. Miles killed Serena and Captain Saldo. Bison, trying to intervene, was also killed. Their bodies were likely weighted down and thrown overboard, lost forever in the depths of the Pacific. The Hakuna Matata returned to port with only one man aboard, and a mystery sealed by the sea. Legacy of a lost star. The disappearance of Bison Dele shocked the sports world. He was remembered not only for his NBA career but for the way he chose to leave it behind. Few athletes have walked away at the height of their game. Fewer still have embraced such a wandering, unconventional path. Friends recalled his generosity, his music, his art, and his relentless pursuit of freedom. To them, his death was tragic not just because it ended his life, but because it silenced a spirit that refused to be confined. Reflections. The Pacific Ocean holds many mysteries. But few are as haunting as the fate of Bison Dele. He was a man who lived by choice, not by expectation. He left behind fame, wealth, and a career to follow the call of something larger, something harder to define. And yet, in the end, his life was cut short not by the sea itself, but by betrayal within his own family. His story reminds us of how fragile even the freest lives can be. A man who walked away from everything still could not escape fate. Today, the Hakuna Matata is gone, his body never recovered, his voice never heard again. But his story lingers, in the questions we still ask, in the silence of the ocean, and in the legacy of a man who dared to live differently. The vanishing of Richie Edwards. It begins with a hotel room key that was never returned. A car abandoned by a bridge. And a man whose words and music defined an era of anguish and rebellion. His name was Richie James Edwards, lyricist and guitarist for the Manic Street Preachers. On February 1, 1995, he vanished. To this day, no trace of him has ever been found. A voice of darkness and defiance. Richie Edwards was born in 1967 in Blackwood, Wales. He grew up quiet, thoughtful, but deeply immersed in literature and philosophy. In the late 1980s, he joined the Manic Street Preachers, a band that fused punk energy with intellectual fire. Richie didn't play lead guitar with technical brilliance, but his presence gave the band something far more powerful: words. He wrote lyrics that were searing, poetic, and filled with despair. Songs like Faster and 4 Stone 7 Pounds explored self-destruction, politics, and identity with raw intensity. Fans saw him as the band's dark conscience, the voice that went deeper than music. But behind the artistry lay a man in pain. Struggles within. By the early 1990s, Richie's inner battles were visible. He suffered from severe depression, alcohol abuse, and self-harm. In 1991, after a gig, he famously carved the words, "For real," into his arm with a razor blade during an interview, a shocking gesture that seemed to blur the line between performance and confession. Friends and colleagues grew concerned. Bandmates supported him as best they could, but the intensity of touring, recording, and media attention weighed heavily on him. In 1994, Richie checked into a psychiatric hospital. When he emerged, he seemed fragile but determined to keep working. He even completed an album with the Manics, The Holy Bible, a record that remains one of the most uncompromising and harrowing albums in British rock history. But Richie's demons were never far away. The final days. On January 31, 1995, Richie and bandmate James Dean Bradfield were scheduled to fly to the United States for promotional work. That night, Richie stayed at the Embassy Hotel in London. He withdrew £200 a day in cash over 2 weeks, a pattern that suggested preparation. He shaved his head, packed belongings, and left behind gifts for friends, including books and artwork. On the morning of February 1st, he checked out of the hotel. He drove his Vauxhall Cavalier east toward Wales. Somewhere along that journey, Richie Edwards disappeared. The car at the bridge 2 weeks later, on February 14th, Richie's abandoned car was discovered at the Ost services near the Severn Bridge, a notorious site for suicides. Inside were his passport, his credit cards, and photographs of his family. Police believed he may have walked onto the bridge and jumped. To many, it seemed a tragic but plausible explanation. He had long battled despair. The Severn Bridge had claimed many lives before. But there was no body. No eyewitnesses. No confirmation. And that uncertainty opened the door to another possibility. Theories of disappearance. 1. Suicide. The most accepted theory is that Richie ended his own life at the Severn Bridge. The abandoned car, the personal struggles, the final preparations, all point toward this conclusion. But without a body, certainty was impossible. 2. Planned disappearance. Some believe Richie staged his vanishing. He had withdrawn large amounts of cash, enough to live modestly for some time. There were alleged sightings of him in Wales, London, and even overseas, in Goa, the Canary Islands, and Fuerteventura. None were confirmed, but each fueled speculation that he had deliberately chosen to leave his old life behind. 3. Breakdown and accident. Another theory suggests Richie left in a confused state and may have died accidentally, lost in rural Wales or in the waters near the bridge. Each explanation offers fragments of truth but no complete picture. Family and legacy. For Richie's family, the uncertainty was torment. His parents refused to believe in suicide, insisting that he had planned a new life away from the spotlight. His sister Rachel campaigned tirelessly to keep the search alive. In 2008, more than a decade after his disappearance, Richie Edwards was officially declared presumed dead. Yet for fans and family, the case remains open in spirit. The Manic Street Preachers carried on, dedicating their work to him. In 2009, they released Journal for Plague Lovers, an album built entirely from Richie's recovered notebooks and lyrics. His words lived on, even as his body remained absent. The myth of Richie Edwards. Over time, Richie Edwards became more than a missing musician. He became a myth, a figure compared to poets like Rimbaud or Sylvia Plath, whose brilliance was entwined with pain. His disappearance has been analyzed in books, documentaries, and countless fan discussions. Was it escape? Was it despair? Or was it simply the unresolved tragedy of a man who couldn't reconcile his inner turmoil with the world around him? What lingers most are his words. In his journals, he once wrote, "I do not believe in things, I believe in people. And people die. And people disappear." It is hard not to read those lines as a premonition. Reflections. The story of Richie Edwards is not just about one man vanishing. It is about the fragility of identity, the weight of art, and the enduring silence of unanswered questions. If he ended his life at the Severn Bridge, the river has hidden him for eternity. If he chose to disappear, his secret remains unbroken. What we know is this: Richie Edwards burned brightly in a short span of years, left behind words that cut to the core of human struggle, and then slipped beyond our sight. And perhaps that is why his story endures, because in not knowing, we are forced to confront the same abyss he gazed into. The car was found. The bridge still stands. But Richie himself remains, somewhere between legend and loss. The disappearance of Spalding Gray. It begins with a man known for speaking openly, pouring out his life on stage, turning personal stories into performances that felt raw, unfiltered, and true. His name was Spalding Gray, actor, writer, and master of the monologue. On January 10, 2004, he left his New York apartment. He never returned. 2 months later, his body was pulled from the East River. But even with that discovery, questions linger about what really happened in the final hours of his life. The master of the monologue Spalding Rockwell Gray was born in Rhode Island in 1941. His early life was marked by art, books, and tragedy. When he was 26, his mother died by suicide, a loss that haunted him throughout his life and later became a recurring theme in his work. By the 1970s, Gray had carved out a unique niche in theater. He developed what he called autobiographical monologues, performances where he sat at a desk with nothing but a notebook and a glass of water, speaking directly to the audience about his life. His delivery was hypnotic, funny, vulnerable, and unflinchingly honest. He told stories of childhood, family, relationships, neuroses, and adventures, weaving them into narratives that felt more real than fiction. His breakthrough came in 1987 with Swimming to Cambodia, a monologue-turned-film directed by Jonathan Demme. The performance chronicled his experience acting in the movie The Killing Fields in Thailand, mixing humor, philosophy, and confessions of personal fear. Over the years, Gray became a cultural figure, the man who turned everyday anxieties into art. But beneath the surface, his openness was also a reflection of deep internal struggle. Shadows beneath the words throughout his career, Gray battled depression and anxiety. He spoke candidly about therapy, breakdowns, and his fear of inheriting the same mental illness that had plagued his mother. In 2001, tragedy struck again. While vacationing in Ireland, he was in a devastating car accident. He suffered a broken hip, a skull fracture, and nerve damage that left him in constant pain. The accident worsened his depression. Friends noticed a change. Once quick and witty, Gray became slower, more withdrawn. He continued to write and perform, but there was a heaviness to him that hadn't been there before. The man who had spent decades narrating his life to the world seemed now to be narrating his decline. The last days on January 10, 2004, Spalding Gray had dinner with his family at their home in New York. He was 62 years old. His wife, Kathleen Russo, later recalled that he was quiet but affectionate. After dinner, he told her he was going out for a walk. He never came back. At first, his family hoped he might return in a day or two, perhaps after wandering off to collect his thoughts. But as hours became days, and days turned into weeks, hope faded. Search efforts spread across New York. Posters went up. Friends and fellow artists pleaded for information. But there were no sightings, no leads, no trace. The discovery on March 7, 2004, 2 months after his disappearance, 2 men spotted a body floating in the East River near Brooklyn. It was Spalding Gray. The coroner determined that he had drowned, and authorities ruled the death a suicide. The most likely scenario was that he had jumped from the Staten Island ferry, a place known for such tragedies. His family, while devastated, accepted the ruling. For those who knew him, it seemed tragically consistent with the life he had lived, a man who had wrestled with mental illness, who had spoken openly about death, and who had often blurred the line between performance and confession. Yet, even with the official explanation, mystery remains. Questions without answers. Why that night? Why that moment? Some believe the pain from his accident became unbearable. Others point to his lifelong battle with depression, intensified by trauma and loss. There were also questions about whether his death was entirely intentional. Some wondered if he slipped, or if, in a dissociative state, he acted without full awareness. His wife, Kathleen, described a man torn between his love for his family and his inability to bear his suffering. He adored his children, yet he seemed drawn to the same fate as his mother. The ambiguity only deepened the tragedy. Legacy of a storyteller. Spalding Gray's death marked the end of a voice unlike any other. He was not a traditional actor, nor a stand-up comedian, nor a conventional writer. He was something else, a man who turned his own vulnerability into art, who dared to sit in front of strangers and say, "This is my life. This is who I am." In doing so, he gave others permission to confront their own fears and flaws. His monologues remain some of the most distinctive works of late 20th century theater, blending humor and sorrow with startling honesty. After his death, his collected works, journals, and recordings became even more treasured, offering glimpses into a man who was never afraid to share the darkest corners of himself. Reflections. The disappearance and death of Spalding Gray remind us of the fragile boundary between public persona and private struggle. On stage, he seemed in control, spinning chaos into narrative. Off stage, the chaos often consumed him. When he vanished that night in 2004, he left behind not only a grieving family but also an unfinished story. His voice, once so present, ended in silence. Perhaps, in a way, that silence was his final monologue, a departure that left the audience with questions rather than answers. Spalding Gray's life was about telling the truth, even when it hurt. And his death forces us to confront the most difficult truth of all, that sometimes, even those who share everything still carry a weight no one else can lift. The disappearance of Patrick McDermott. It begins with a fishing trip off the coast of California. A boat returns to harbor. But one passenger is missing. His name was Patrick Kim McDermott, a cameraman, a drifter, and the on-again, off-again boyfriend of singer Olivia Newton-John. On June 30, 2005, he vanished into the Pacific Ocean. No one has seen him since. But unlike most disappearances at sea, the story of Pat McDermott has never been settled. Because some believe he may still be alive. A life on the margins. Patrick McDermott was born in 1956 in Korea, later adopted and raised in the United States. As an adult, he worked behind the camera, often as a lighting and camera operator in Los Angeles. He was known in the entertainment world, though not famous himself. By the late 1990s, his name became publicly linked with Olivia Newton-John, the star of Grease and an international music icon. The two dated on and off for nearly a decade. But while Olivia was a household name, McDermott's own life was less glamorous. He struggled financially. He owed thousands in unpaid child support. Friends described him as restless, sometimes troubled, always chasing stability he never seemed to find. And in 2005, his story took a turn that still fuels speculation today. The fishing trip on June 30, McDermott boarded a chartered fishing boat called the Freedom, departing from San Pedro, California, with 22 other passengers. The Freedom was an overnight trip, heading out into the Pacific for a day of deep-sea fishing. Witnesses recalled McDermott quietly keeping to himself, as was his nature. When the boat docked on July 1, no one noticed anything unusual. Each passenger disembarked. Crew members cleaned the decks. Life moved on. It was only days later, when McDermott failed to show up for obligations, that questions arose. The discovery of his absence on July 6, McDermott was officially reported missing. His car was still parked at the marina. His personal belongings, including his wallet, were gone. The Coast Guard launched an investigation. Passengers and crew from the Freedom were interviewed. Strangely, no one remembered seeing McDermott disembark. Some thought they had spotted him on deck during the night. Others could not recall. The most likely scenario, officials concluded, was that McDermott had fallen overboard during the trip. No one noticed, and he drowned silently in the Pacific. But there was no body. No definitive evidence. Only absence. Theories begin from the beginning. McDermott's disappearance carried an unusual weight because of his connection to Olivia Newton-John. Media outlets around the world reported on the case. Investigators soon uncovered troubling details. McDermott had been in debt. He owed more than $8,000 in child support to his ex-wife. He was facing financial hardship and personal disappointment. These facts led to a second theory, that McDermott had staged his death to escape. Signs of a possible escape. In the months following his disappearance, several oddities emerged. Investigators learned that McDermott had withdrawn most of his savings before the fishing trip. He had also packed up certain belongings. Some acquaintances suggested he had spoken vaguely about wanting to start over. In 2006, a private investigator hired by an NBC television program claimed to have found evidence McDermott was alive in Mexico. According to their findings, digital footprints suggested he had logged into websites from Baja California. Later, in 2009 and 2010, reports surfaced of sightings, a tall, quiet man resembling McDermott, living near remote seaside villages. Locals in Mexico claimed to have seen him with a new partner. But none of the alleged sightings were confirmed. The Olivia Newton-John connection. For Olivia Newton-John, the disappearance was a painful chapter. She had ended her romantic relationship with McDermott but still considered him a close friend. For years, she avoided public speculation, later admitting that the uncertainty haunted her. Was he dead at sea? Or alive somewhere, living in exile? In interviews, she eventually expressed her belief that McDermott likely perished that night. But like many who followed the case, she was left with no closure. Investigations and doubts. The U.S. Coast Guard's official conclusion, released in 2008, was that McDermott was most likely lost at sea. The report cited no evidence of foul play, but it acknowledged the possibility that he had staged his disappearance. Private investigators continued to pursue leads. In 2010, a group calling itself Dateline NBC's investigators claimed to have traced McDermott to Mexico. They pointed to photographs of a man with similar features. The story captured headlines again. But experts disputed the images, saying they were inconclusive. DNA comparisons were never made. The question lingered: had McDermott really drowned, or had he escaped debt and responsibility by slipping into a new identity? Why it resonates. The story of Patrick McDermott resonates because it sits at the crossroads of tragedy and possibility. If he drowned, then his death was lonely, accidental, and devastating for those who loved him. If he survived, then he chose exile, vanishing into anonymity at the cost of everyone he left behind. Both explanations are unsatisfying. Both leave gaps. For Olivia Newton-John, who passed away in 2022, the mystery remained unsolved throughout her lifetime. For McDermott's family, the wound has never fully closed. Reflections. The sea has always swallowed secrets. On that summer night in 2005, somewhere off the coast of California, Patrick McDermott either lost his life or shed it deliberately. We may never know which. His story forces us to confront a haunting possibility, that disappearance itself can be both an accident and an act of will. A man gone without a trace, but not without questions. Script: The disappearance of Henry Hudson. It begins in the icy waters of the far north. A ship trapped by shifting ice. A crew weakened by hunger, fear, and bitter cold. And a captain, determined, stubborn, perhaps doomed by his own ambition. His name was Henry Hudson, one of the most famous explorers of the early 17th century. In June 1611, he vanished into the Arctic, cast adrift by his own men. His fate has never been discovered. The age of exploration. The early 1600s were an age of fierce competition. European powers sent ships across oceans searching for new trade routes, colonies, and wealth. Among the most sought-after paths was the Northwest Passage, a route across the Arctic that could link Europe to Asia more directly than sailing around Africa or South America. Henry Hudson, an English navigator, emerged as one of the boldest figures of this era. Skilled, ambitious, and relentless, he believed such a passage could be found. Early voyages. Hudson's first expeditions took him north in search of a way past the ice. In 1607 and 1608, he explored the Arctic seas near Greenland and Spitsbergen, hoping to find an open route. He never succeeded, but his voyages brought valuable knowledge of the northern waters. In 1609, Hudson sailed under the Dutch East India Company. His instructions were to seek a passage northeast, but ice blocked the way. Instead, he turned west, crossing the Atlantic and exploring the river in present-day New York that now bears his name, the Hudson River. That voyage cemented his reputation as a daring navigator. But his obsession remained: the search for the Northwest Passage. The final expedition in 1610, backed by English investors, Hudson set sail once more aboard the ship Discovery. His goal: to push deeper into the Arctic than ever before. The voyage was grueling. The crew battled storms, treacherous ice, and dwindling supplies. But Hudson pressed forward. Eventually, the Discovery sailed into a vast inland sea, today known as Hudson Bay. Hudson believed he was on the threshold of the passage to Asia. He urged the crew onward, mapping the enormous bay, convinced that its channels might lead west. But winter came early. The ship became trapped in ice. The men had no choice but to endure the long Arctic darkness. Winter in the ice. The winter of 1610 to 1611 was brutal. The crew suffered from frostbite, malnutrition, and scurvy. Supplies ran low. Tensions rose. Hudson, by all accounts, was a difficult commander. He demanded loyalty, but he also made enemies. His insistence on continuing the search, even when conditions worsened, strained the men's patience. By the time the ice began to thaw in June 1611, the crew had reached their breaking point. The mutiny accounts from survivors describe what happened next. On June 22, 1611, a mutiny broke out aboard the Discovery. Hudson, his teenage son John, and a handful of loyal crewmen were seized. The mutineers forced them into a small open boat, a shallop, with only minimal provisions. The Discovery then sailed away, leaving Hudson and his companions to the mercy of the Arctic. No one ever saw them again. The journey home. The mutineers themselves faced a terrible voyage. As they sailed back toward England, several died from hunger and conflict. By the time the Discovery returned in September 1611, only 8 survivors remained. They were arrested and brought to trial. But the evidence was complicated. No clear punishment was ever given, and many of the men eventually returned to sea. Hudson's disappearance, meanwhile, became one of the enduring mysteries of the Age of Exploration. Theories of his fate. What became of Henry Hudson after the mutiny? 1. Death at sea. The most likely explanation is that Hudson and his companions perished quickly, from exposure, starvation, or drowning in the icy waters of Hudson Bay. With only a small boat, survival would have been nearly impossible. 2. Survival among indigenous peoples. Some historians have suggested that Hudson and his men may have reached land and lived for a time among indigenous communities. Oral traditions in some Arctic regions speak of strangers arriving by boat in the early 1600s. But no conclusive link has ever been made. 3. Lost in the ice. Others speculate that Hudson may have attempted to continue exploring in the small boat, still clinging to his dream of finding the passage. If so, his determination may have carried him deeper into the frozen channels until the ice claimed him. No remains, artifacts, or definitive records have ever surfaced. The Arctic keeps its secrets. Legacy of an explorer. Despite the tragic end, Henry Hudson's name endures on maps. The Hudson River, the Hudson Strait, and the Hudson Bay all bear his name. His voyages expanded European understanding of North America and paved the way for future exploration and colonization. But his legacy is double-edged. He is remembered as both a visionary explorer and a flawed leader whose stubbornness may have doomed his crew. Reflections. The story of Henry Hudson is not only about discovery. It is about the limits of ambition, the fragility of human endurance, and the unforgiving power of nature. He sought a passage to Asia and instead found a frozen grave. He commanded loyalty, yet died betrayed. He carved his name into geography, yet left no trace of himself. For centuries later, his fate remains one of history's great mysteries. Did Henry Hudson and his son die swiftly in the cold waters of the bay? Or did they struggle on, survivors for a time in the vast Arctic wilderness? The silence of the North offers no answers. And so Henry Hudson endures, not only on maps, but in the eternal question of what became of the man who chased the edge of the world and vanished into ice. The mystery of George Mallory. It begins on the icy slopes of the world's highest mountain. 2 climbers roped together, moving steadily toward a summit that had never been reached. One of them was George Mallory, an English schoolteacher turned mountaineer. On June 8, 1924, he disappeared high on Mount Everest. To this day, no one knows if he stood on the summit before he fell, making his story one of the greatest mysteries in the history of exploration. The man behind the dream. George Lee Mallory was born in 1886 in Cheshire, England. A gifted student, he developed a passion for climbing in his youth, scaling cliffs in the Alps and Britain's Lake District. He became known not only for his skill, but also for his charm and intellect. Friends described him as intense, charismatic, and utterly captivated by the idea of challenge. By the 1920s, Mallory had become a central figure in Britain's efforts to conquer Mount Everest. At the time, the mountain was seen as the ultimate prize in exploration, remote, dangerous, and unconquered. When asked why he wanted to climb it, Mallory famously replied, "Because it's there." Early expeditions. Mallory took part in the first two British expeditions to Everest in 1921 and 1922. These journeys mapped routes, tested equipment, and revealed the brutal conditions climbers would face: thin air, extreme cold, and shifting weather that could turn deadly in minutes. In 1922, Mallory and his team reached a then-record altitude of 26,980 feet, still short of the summit, but closer than anyone before them. Tragically, that expedition ended with an avalanche that killed 7 Sherpa porters. Yet Mallory remained undeterred. Everest had become his obsession. The final expedition in 1924, Mallory returned to Everest for the third British expedition, accompanied by fellow climbers Andrew, Sandy, Irvine, Noel Odell, and others. The plan was ambitious. Mallory, now 37 years old, paired with the 22-year-old Irvine, who was strong, practical, and skilled with the experimental oxygen equipment that might make the difference at extreme altitudes. On June 8, Mallory and Irvine set off from their high camp, pushing toward the summit. The last confirmed sighting came from Noel Odell, another member of the team. Watching through a break in the clouds, Odell claimed he saw 2 figures climbing just below the final step to the summit, moving with great alacrity. Then the clouds closed in. Mallory and Irvine vanished from sight. They never returned. The search for days, Odell and others searched the mountain's upper slopes. But storms and altitude forced them back. No trace of the 2 climbers was found. News of the disappearance stunned the world. Mallory and Irvine were hailed as heroes, their attempt celebrated even in failure. But the central question remained unanswered: had they reached the summit before they died? If they had, Mallory and Irvine would have been the first to stand atop Everest, nearly 3 decades before Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay in 1953. Theories and speculation. For decades, mountaineers and historians debated what happened that day. 1. Summit success. Some believe Mallory and Irvine reached the top. Odell's sighting suggested they were high on the ridge, close to the summit step. Mallory's skill and Irvine's technical expertise could have carried them to the top before disaster struck on the descent. 2. Turned back. Others argue they never made it. The obstacles of the second step, on the northeast ridge, may have been insurmountable with the equipment of 1924. Exhaustion, weather, and failing oxygen could have forced them to retreat, only to fall on the way down. 3. The fatal fall. What is certain is that they fell. But from how high, and after how much success, remains unknown. Rediscovery. On the mountain for decades, Everest kept its secret. Then, in 1999, an American-led expedition searching for clues made a remarkable discovery. At 26,760 feet, they found the body of George Mallory. Preserved by the cold, his clothing and features were still recognizable. He had injuries consistent with a fall, including a broken leg. A rope injury around his waist suggested he and Irvine had been tied together when one of them slipped. But one detail stood out: Mallory carried photographs of his wife Ruth on every climb, intending to leave one on the summit. When his body was found, the photo was missing. Had he placed it at the top before he fell? The missing camera. Another enduring mystery is the camera Mallory and Irvine carried. Irvine, the younger climber, was believed to have been holding it. If recovered, the film might reveal whether they reached the summit. To this day, Irvine's body, and the camera, have not been found. Search expeditions continue, hoping the ice may someday release the final clue. Legacy and debate. In 1953, when Hillary and Norgay stood on the summit, they became the first confirmed climbers to reach the top of Everest. But the question of Mallory and Irvine lingers. Some historians argue that Mallory's equipment, hobnail boots, wool clothing, primitive oxygen tanks, made success impossible. Others point to his determination and skill, suggesting he might have achieved the impossible. For many climbers, the truth almost doesn't matter. Mallory's attempt represents the spirit of exploration, the willingness to risk everything in pursuit of a dream. Reflections: The disappearance of George Mallory is not simply a story of death on a mountain. It is a story of human ambition, the thin line between glory and tragedy, and the enduring power of mystery. If he reached the top, he died a conqueror. If he fell short, he died in pursuit of the dream that defined his life. Either way, George Mallory remains forever bound to Everest, the man who climbed, because it's there, and who vanished into the clouds, leaving behind one of history's greatest unanswered questions.
The mystery of Sandy Irvine. It begins on the roof of the world, with two men climbing into the clouds. One was George Mallory, already a celebrated mountaineer. The other was Andrew "Sandy" Irvine, young, strong, and relatively untested. On June 8, 1924, they vanished on Mount Everest. Their disappearance remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of exploration. The young engineer Andrew Comyn Irvine was born in 1902 in Cheshire, England. He was only 22 years old when he joined the British Everest expedition of 1924. Unlike Mallory, Irvine was not a seasoned mountaineer. He was, however, an accomplished athlete and a skilled engineer. At Oxford, he rowed for the university team. He was known for his stamina, toughness, and mechanical ability. It was this mechanical expertise that caught the attention of the Everest Committee. The 1924 expedition planned to use oxygen sets, experimental technology at the time. Irvine quickly proved himself adept at repairing and modifying the cumbersome devices, making him invaluable to the team. He may not have had Mallory's climbing experience, but he had something else the expedition desperately needed: reliability with the equipment that might mean the difference between life and death. The Everest dream for Britain. Everest was more than a mountain. In the aftermath of World War I, the country was searching for symbols of resilience and glory. Reaching the summit of the world's highest peak would restore a sense of national pride. The 1924 expedition was led by Edward Norton and included veterans like Noel Odell, but it was Mallory and Irvine who would take center stage. Mallory, 37, was the face of Everest. Irvine, 22, was the surprise partner chosen for the final summit attempt. Some questioned the pairing. Why entrust such a historic climb to a novice? But Mallory believed Irvine's strength, and his skill with the oxygen tanks, would be decisive. Into the clouds on June 8, 1924, Mallory and Irvine left their high camp at around 26,800 feet. They carried oxygen sets, climbing ropes, and sheer determination. From below, Noel Odell watched. At around 12:50 p.m., through a rare break in the clouds, he claimed to see two figures, moving strongly on a rock step high on the northeast ridge. It was the last confirmed sighting of Sandy Irvine and George Mallory. The clouds closed in. The mountain kept its silence. The search. Odell climbed higher, hoping to meet them on the descent. But worsening weather forced him back. Days later, the expedition withdrew, empty-handed. In Britain, the news of their disappearance was met with both grief and pride. Newspapers hailed Mallory and Irvine as heroes. Some even suggested they had reached the summit before they died. If true, it would mean the first ascent of Everest happened nearly 3 decades before Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. But without evidence, the question remained: how far did they get? Clues on the mountain. Over the decades, expeditions returned to Everest in search of answers. In 1933, climbers found Irvine's ice axe at about 27,760 feet, near the northeast ridge. Its position suggested a fall, perhaps during the descent. The discovery deepened the mystery. Had they reached the top before the accident? Or had the axe been dropped earlier? Then, in 1999, an American-led team searching the North Face made a stunning find: the body of George Mallory, preserved in the ice. His injuries showed he had fallen, but the location of his body raised questions about how far he and Irvine had climbed before disaster struck. Mallory was found. But Irvine was not. The missing camera, perhaps the greatest hope for solving the mystery, lies with Irvine himself. He was believed to be carrying a small vest pocket Kodak camera on the climb. If his body, and the camera, are ever recovered, the film could reveal whether the pair reached the summit. In 2019, a Chinese expedition reportedly came close to finding Irvine's body, based on earlier accounts from climbers who claimed to have seen remains in the 1960s. But no confirmation was released, and the camera remains missing. To this day, the mountain keeps its secret. Theories of fate: historians and climbers have debated what happened on that final day in 1924. 1. They reached the summit. Some argue Mallory and Irvine did reach the top. Odell's sighting placed them close to the final obstacles, and Mallory's determination was legendary. Supporters note that the photo of Mallory's wife Ruth, which he had promised to leave on the summit, was not found on his body. Did he leave it there before falling on the descent? 2. They fell short. Others believe they never made it. The second step, on the northeast ridge, a near-vertical rock face at 28,000 feet, may have been beyond their ability with 1920s equipment. If they were forced to turn back, fatigue or weather could have doomed them on the way down. 3. A fatal accident. The most widely accepted explanation is that they fell while descending. The location of Mallory's body and Irvine's axe suggest a slip, perhaps while roped together, leading to fatal injuries. But without Irvine, the truth cannot be confirmed. The legacy of Sandy Irvine: for decades, Irvine's story has been overshadowed by Mallory's fame. But Sandy remains an essential part of the mystery. He was young, inexperienced, and yet chosen for one of the most important climbs in history. His mechanical genius with oxygen may have given them a fighting chance. His strength may have carried Mallory higher than anyone expected. And it is his missing body, and the camera he may still carry, that could one day resolve the debate that has haunted Everest for nearly a century. Reflections: The disappearance of Sandy Irvine is a story of youth, ambition, and the thin line between triumph and tragedy. At 22, he stood on the edge of history, tethered to a man who believed Everest was his destiny. Together, they vanished into cloud and legend. Did Sandy Irvine stand on the highest point on Earth, decades before anyone else? Or did he fall just short, another victim of the mountain's ruthless power? Until the mountain gives up its secret, his story will remain unfinished. What is certain is this: Sandy Irvine, the young engineer from Cheshire, will forever be bound to the greatest mystery Everest has ever known.
The enigma of François Guérin. It begins in the glittering courts of 18th-century France. A world of powdered wigs, ornate salons, and portraits that preserved the faces of an age. Among the artists who captured this world was François Guérin, a painter whose name once held weight in Parisian circles. Today, his works survive, delicate pastels and refined portraits, yet his life remains partly obscured, his legacy overshadowed by greater names of his time. Who was François Guérin, and why does his story remain shrouded in uncertainty? An artist in the Age of Enlightenment, François Guérin was born around 1717 in France, at a time when the Enlightenment was reshaping European thought. Art was not merely decorative, it was a reflection of culture, philosophy, and power. Guérin trained in a tradition that prized precision and elegance. His chosen medium was pastel, delicate, luminous, and fragile. Pastel portraiture was fashionable among the elite, offering both immediacy and intimacy. In Guérin's hands, the medium came alive. He became known for capturing sitters with subtle detail, powdered hair, embroidered garments, the faintest expressions that suggested status, wit, or melancholy. His style belonged to the Rococo era, where lightness and grace dominated the arts. The Parisian circles. By the mid-18th century, Guérin had secured a place among Parisian artists. He was associated with the Académie de Saint-Luc, a guild of painters and sculptors that rivaled the official Royal Academy. The Académie de Saint-Luc gave artists like Guérin a platform outside the rigid control of the crown. Here, painters could exhibit and sell their works more freely. But it also placed them on the margins of official recognition, competing with the more prestigious academicians favored by the monarchy. Guérin's clientele included wealthy merchants, members of the court, and rising figures of the Enlightenment era. His portraits were intimate windows into the lives of people whose names might otherwise be forgotten. And yet, despite his success, history has left his biography sparse, the details scattered. The mystery of the oeuvre. One of the mysteries surrounding François Guérin lies in attribution. Pastel painting, by nature, is fragile. Many works have not survived, lost to time, humidity, or neglect. Others have been misattributed to more famous names such as Maurice Quintin de la Tour or Jean-Baptiste Perronneau, the giants of 18th-century pastel portraiture. Art historians debate which works are truly Guérin's. His hand is recognized in certain portraits of elegantly dressed women, in likenesses of Parisian bourgeois families, and in a number of surviving signed canvases. But gaps remain. Was he a prolific artist whose works were scattered under other names? Or was he a modest figure, working quietly in the shadow of greater masters? The revolution approaches. Guérin's career unfolded against a backdrop of seismic change. The Rococo style, with its playful lightness, fell out of favor as the Enlightenment gave way to revolution. By the 1780s, neoclassicism, austere, moral, inspired by Rome and Greece, dominated French art. For pastel artists like Guérin, this shift was devastating. The pastel medium was increasingly seen as frivolous compared to the monumental oil paintings that celebrated civic virtue and revolutionary ideals. Records of Guérin after the 1780s grow faint. He is believed to have lived until 1801, dying in relative obscurity as France transformed from monarchy to revolution, and then toward empire. The man who once painted the elegance of the Ancien Régime slipped quietly into history's margins. Searching the archives, what we know of François Guérin today is pieced together from fragments, signatures on paintings, mentions in exhibition catalogues, guild records, and scattered references in correspondence. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he left no famous students, no treatises on art, no grand commissions for palaces or churches. His works were private, portraits for families, personal keepsakes rather than public monuments. This makes his life difficult to reconstruct. The very intimacy of his art, once prized by his sitters, became a reason for his obscurity. The faces he painted outlived the names of their owners, leaving us with images detached from their stories. The surviving works, despite the gaps, Guérin's surviving portraits still hold remarkable power. In them, we see children with flushed cheeks, women in silk gowns, men in powdered wigs, the quiet dignity of a society on the cusp of upheaval. His pastels have a softness, a gentleness that contrasts with the storm that would soon engulf France. Some of his works reside today in museums and private collections, though they are often overshadowed by the better-known masters of the time. Still, to those who study them, they provide a glimpse into the subtle artistry of a painter who valued intimacy over grandeur. The mystery of memory. The true mystery of François Guérin lies not in scandal or disappearance, but in how history chooses what to remember, and what to forget. Why do some names endure, while others fade? Guérin's contemporaries celebrated his skill, yet within decades, his reputation dimmed. Was it because his works lacked the boldness of Latour? Because his career was tied to the doomed world of the Ancien Régime? Or because the revolution swept away not only kings, but the memory of those who painted them? We cannot be certain. But the silence around his name creates its own intrigue. Reflections. The story of François Guérin is not the story of a vanished explorer or a missing traveler. It is the story of an artist who slipped into obscurity, his life half remembered, his work scattered, his presence reduced to fragments in archives and anonymous faces in pastel. And perhaps that is its own kind of disappearance. Not into the mountains or the sea, but into the folds of history itself. When we look at his portraits today, we see not only the faces of 18th-century France, but the shadow of the man who painted them, a man whose details remain elusive, whose story resists being fully told. François Guérin lived, painted, and vanished into history's silence. And that silence still lingers, like pastel dust on paper, fragile, fading, yet not. The disappearance of Bas Jan Ader. It begins with a small boat, drifting across the vast Atlantic. A man alone at sea, chasing both art and eternity. His name was Bas Jan Ader, a Dutch artist whose work revolved around gravity, failure, and the fragility of human existence. In July 1975, he set sail on what he called In Search of the Miraculous. He never returned. What happened to Bas Jan Ader remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the art world. A life shaped by loss. Ba Jan Ader was born in 1942 in Winschoten, in the Netherlands, during the darkest years of World War II. His father, a minister, was executed by the Nazis for sheltering Jewish refugees. This early loss, and the weight of absence, would haunt Ader's life and work. As a young man, Ader studied art in Amsterdam, then moved to the United States. He settled in California, where he became part of a generation of conceptual artists experimenting with performance, photography, and film. But while many artists of his time embraced irony or spectacle, Ader's work was intimate and vulnerable. He explored the inevitability of falling, both physically and emotionally. Art of Falling. One of Ader's most iconic series was called Fall. In Fall, Los Angeles, 1970, he filmed himself perched on a chair on the roof of his house, slowly tipping backward until he crashed into the bushes below. In Fall 2, Amsterdam, 1970, he rode a bicycle along a canal until he lost control and tumbled into the water. The works were simple, yet profound, metaphors for fragility, surrender, and the inevitability of failure. They were not stunts, but meditations on existence. Ader himself described them as explorations of gravity, but also of grace, the surrender to forces larger than oneself. In Search of the Miraculous. By the mid-1970s, Ader conceived his most ambitious project. He would sail alone across the Atlantic Ocean, from the United States to Europe, in the smallest boat ever to make such a voyage. The journey was not simply an adventure. It was an artwork. He titled it In Search of the Miraculous, a performance of solitude, endurance, and transcendence. On July 9, 1975, he set out from Cape Cod, Massachusetts, in a 13-foot yacht named the Ocean Wave. His plan was to reach Falmouth, England, within 2 or 3 months, completing the second leg of his artistic trilogy. Friends, fellow artists, and his wife Mary Sue Anderson saw him off. His departure was documented in photographs, accompanied by a choir singing sea shanties, a poetic farewell to a journey that blurred art and life. Silence at sea. At first, all seemed well. Radio contact confirmed Ader had made progress into the Atlantic. But then, silence. Weeks passed with no word. By October, worry turned to alarm. Search efforts were launched, but the Atlantic gave up little. In April 1976, nearly a year after his departure, a Spanish fishing vessel discovered Ader's boat drifting off the coast of Ireland. It was partly submerged, damaged, and abandoned. Inside, the logbook was missing. There was no trace of food or personal belongings. And most haunting of all, there was no sign of Bas Jan Ader. Theories and speculation. The disappearance of Bas Jan Ader has invited endless speculation. 1. Accident at sea. The most likely explanation is that Ader was swept overboard in rough weather. His small boat was ill-suited for the vastness of the Atlantic. A sudden storm, a broken line, or a single misstep could have ended his life quickly. 2. Artistic suicide. Some have argued that his disappearance was intentional, the final act of his art. Ader had long been fascinated with themes of loss and surrender. To vanish at sea could have been a deliberate performance, a way of merging life and art into a single irreversible gesture. 3. Mechanical failure and abandonment. Others suggest his boat may have suffered damage, forcing him into the water. The missing logbook adds mystery. Was it lost by chance or deliberately removed? No evidence fully resolves the question. The artist's legacy. What makes Bas Jan Ader's disappearance so compelling is how it reflects the very themes of his work. He was an artist who explored falling, loss, and surrender. In Vanishing at Sea, he seemed to embody his own art, an ultimate fall into the unknown. But was it deliberate, or accidental? Was he in search of the miraculous, or overwhelmed by it? His works are now part of major collections and exhibitions. Photographs of him tipping off chairs or tumbling into canals are studied as meditations on risk, vulnerability, and mortality. And yet, the unfinished final piece, In Search of the Miraculous, defines his legacy more than anything else. Reflections. The story of Bas Jan Ader is a story without an ending. His boat was found. The ocean told part of the tale. But the man himself vanished, leaving his life and work forever entangled in mystery. Perhaps that was his intention. Perhaps not. What we know is that he sailed into the Atlantic with a fragile vessel and a vision that blurred the line between art and existence. And somewhere out there, between wind and wave, he disappeared. Bas Jan Ader once said, "All my work is in essence about falling." In the end, his life became the greatest fall of all, into absence, into legend, into the unknown. Script: The Mystery of Donald Crowhurst. It begins with a race around the world. A lone sailor, a fragile boat, and the promise of glory. His name was Donald Crowhurst, an English businessman who dreamed of adventure. In 1969, he set out to circumnavigate the globe in the Sunday Times Golden Globe race. Months later, his boat was found drifting in the Atlantic. Crowhurst himself was gone. His disappearance remains one of the most haunting stories in the history of sailing. A man with a dream. Donald Charles Alfred Crowhurst was born in 1932 in India, then part of the British Empire. He moved to England as a boy, later working as an engineer and inventor. By the mid-1960s, Crowhurst was a family man with 4 children, living in Teignmouth, Devon. He owned a small electronics business, manufacturing marine equipment. Though not a seasoned sailor, he was passionate about the sea and eager to prove himself. When the Sunday Times announced a competition, the first solo, non-stop, round-the-world yacht race, Crowhurst saw an opportunity. The prize was £5,000 for the fastest circumnavigation, but the real reward was prestige. For a struggling businessman, the race was a chance to gain recognition, secure his company's future, and achieve a personal triumph. The Golden Globe race. The 1968 to 1969 Golden Globe was the first of its kind. Competitors would set sail alone, without stopping, attempting to circle the globe via the treacherous Southern Ocean. The challenge was immense. The seas were vast, the weather brutal, and the isolation nearly unbearable. Among the entrants were experienced sailors like Robin Knox Johnston, Bernard Moitessier, and Che Blythe. Crowhurst, by contrast, was relatively inexperienced. His decision was bold, and risky. The boat, Teignmouth Electron. Crowhurst commissioned a trimaran, the Teignmouth Electron, designed to be lightweight and fast. But time and money were tight. Construction was rushed, corners were cut, and by the time of departure, the vessel was incomplete and untested for such an extreme journey. Still, financial pressure left Crowhurst with little choice. He had secured sponsorship and loans on the condition that he at least set out. If he quit early, he faced ruin. On October 31, 1968, Donald Crowhurst left Teignmouth and sailed into history. Struggles at sea. Almost immediately, Crowhurst encountered problems. His boat leaked. Equipment malfunctioned. His self-designed navigation system failed. He realized the Teignmouth Electron was not capable of surviving the brutal conditions of the Southern Ocean. Continuing south risked certain disaster. Turning back risked financial collapse and public humiliation. Faced with an impossible choice, Crowhurst made a fateful decision. The deception. Instead of following the racecourse into the Southern Ocean, Crowhurst remained in the Atlantic. He began falsifying his position reports, sending messages to suggest he was making steady progress around the globe. In reality, he sailed erratically in the South Atlantic, waiting out the months while the other competitors circled the globe. His plan was to rejoin the race route later, appearing as though he had completed the circumnavigation. It was a desperate gamble, one that relied on luck, secrecy, and the hope that no one would uncover the truth. The psychological toll at first, Crowhurst's deception seemed to work. Reports placed him as a contender, and by mid-1969, it even appeared he might win the race. But the isolation began to weigh on him. Alone for months, trapped in the lie he had constructed, Crowhurst filled his logbooks with increasingly erratic writings. He wrestled with guilt, fear, and the burden of living a double life. His entries veered between technical notes, philosophical reflections, and signs of mental breakdown. The closer he came to re-entering the race, the more unbearable the pressure became. Discovery of the boat on July 10, 1969, the Teignmouth Electron was discovered drifting, abandoned, in the mid-Atlantic. Inside, investigators found Crowhurst's logbooks. The records revealed the truth, his falsified reports, his deception, and his final descent into despair. The last entries suggested a man unraveling. He wrote of cosmic forces, of time and destiny, and of ending the game. His final log was dated June 29, 1969. After that, silence. Crowhurst's body was never found. It is believed he stepped overboard, choosing to end his life rather than face exposure. The aftermath. The race concluded with Robin Knox Johnston becoming the first person to successfully sail solo, non-stop, around the world. He donated his prize money to Crowhurst's widow and children. Bernard Moitessier, another competitor, famously abandoned the race mid-voyage, sailing on for personal fulfillment rather than competition. His decision stood in stark contrast to Crowhurst's tragic deception. For Crowhurst's family, the loss was devastating. His widow, Claire, struggled with the legacy of both his disappearance and his deception. Over time, however, Crowhurst's story came to be seen not simply as fraud, but as tragedy, a tale of ambition colliding with human frailty. Interpretations and mystery. What happened in Donald Crowhurst's final days remains partly unknowable. Did he plan his death calmly, or was it the result of sudden despair? Was he driven by guilt, madness, or a desire to escape exposure? Some argue he may not have intended suicide, suggesting he could have fallen accidentally. But the writings in his logbooks, filled with increasingly mystical and despairing reflections, suggest a deliberate choice. In the end, the ocean keeps its secrets. Legacy. Donald Crowhurst has since become the subject of documentaries, films, and books. His story resonates because it reflects both the grandeur and the fragility of human ambition. He was not a seasoned adventurer, but a man driven by dreams and desperation. He wanted victory, respect, and security for his family. Instead, he became a symbol of the crushing weight of expectation, and the dangers of deception. The Teignmouth Electron, the ghostly vessel left behind, became an artifact of this tragedy, a reminder of how fragile the line is between triumph and disaster. Reflections. The story of Donald Crowhurst is a story of courage, deception, and collapse. He set out to conquer the world's oceans. Instead, he was conquered by his own fears. He dreamed of returning home as a hero. Instead, he vanished into the Atlantic, leaving behind only fragments of his struggle. And the question remains, was he a fraud who betrayed the race, or a tragic figure undone by impossible circumstances? Perhaps both. What is certain is this: Donald Crowhurst's voyage was not only a physical journey, but a descent into the most treacherous waters of all, the human mind. The disappearance of Tony Jones. It begins on a remote stretch of coastline in northern Queensland, Australia. A young backpacker vanishes into the night, leaving no trace behind. His name was Anthony "Tony" Jones. In November 1982, he disappeared while hitchhiking near Townsville. Despite decades of investigations, his case remains one of Australia's most enduring mysteries. A young adventurer, Anthony "Tony" Jones, was born in 1962 in Western Australia. At 20 years old, he was the youngest of 7 children in a close-knit family. Friends described him as cheerful, adventurous, and independent, the kind of young man eager to explore the world. In 1982, Tony embarked on a solo backpacking trip around Australia. It was the classic journey of youth: long roads, new towns, and the promise of freedom. He kept in touch with his family, writing letters and calling when he could. By late October, Tony had made his way to Queensland. He was last seen in the Townsville area, near the Ross River Bridge, on the night of November 3, 1982. After that, he vanished. The last known movements. The details of Tony's final hours are fragmentary. Witnesses reported seeing him hitchhiking on the Flinders Highway near Townsville. He was believed to be traveling north toward Cairns, planning to meet friends. At around 7:30 p.m., he phoned his brother from a payphone, sounding relaxed and upbeat. That was the last confirmed contact. Later that evening, a man matching Tony's description was reportedly seen near the bridge, carrying his backpack. But by morning, he was gone. His belongings were never recovered. The search. When Tony failed to make contact in the days that followed, his family raised the alarm. Police mounted a search across Townsville and the surrounding area. Volunteers joined the effort, combing the highways and scrubland. But there were no signs of struggle, no body, and no personal items found. Tony seemed to have disappeared into thin air. The Flinders Highway, where Tony was last seen, had a troubling reputation. Over the years, it became known as the Highway of Death, linked to multiple disappearances and unsolved murders of hitchhikers. Tony's case would become the first in a series of unsettling mysteries tied to that stretch of road. A family's long fight for the Jones family, the uncertainty was unbearable. Tony's parents and siblings campaigned tirelessly for answers, pressuring authorities to keep the case open. Over time, they grew frustrated with what they saw as a lack of urgency in the investigation. Rumors circulated of inadequate follow-ups and missed opportunities in the early days. Despite this, the family never gave up. They continued to raise Tony's name in the media, keeping his case alive in public memory. Breakthroughs and leads. Over the decades, new leads occasionally surfaced. Witnesses claimed to have seen suspicious vehicles in the area that night. Some reports suggested Tony may have accepted a lift from someone who meant him harm. In the late 1980s and 1990s, police investigated possible connections between Tony's disappearance and known offenders, including serial killers operating in Queensland at the time. But no definitive link was ever proven. The strongest lead came in 2002, when a man alleged he had overheard another individual bragging about killing Tony near the Ross River Bridge. The tip led to renewed searches and excavations in the area, but again, nothing was found. In 2010, the case was reclassified as a suspected homicide. A coroner's inquest in 2014 concluded that Tony Jones was likely murdered on the night of his disappearance. But the identity of his killer remains unknown. Theories of Fate. 1. Murder by a stranger. The most widely accepted theory is that Tony accepted a lift while hitchhiking and was murdered by the driver. This would align with other disappearances along the Flinders Highway in the years that followed. 2. A serial offender connection. Some believe Tony was an early victim of a serial killer operating in Queensland in the 1980s. Several known criminals were active in the region at the time, but investigators have never been able to tie any of them conclusively to Tony's case. 3. A random act of violence. Another possibility is that Tony was attacked at or near the bridge, perhaps by locals, with his body concealed in the surrounding scrubland or waters. Each theory has merit. None have brought certainty. The Highway of Mystery. Tony Jones's disappearance became the first of several cases associated with the Flinders Highway. In later years, multiple young women vanished or were found murdered along the same road. These patterns gave rise to speculation about a single predator, though official investigations have not confirmed a link. For many, the shadow of Tony's case looms over them all, the first thread in a dark pattern of mystery and violence along the Queensland highways. Legacy and memory. More than 40 years have passed since Tony Jones disappeared. His family has never stopped seeking answers. They have pushed for renewed investigations, offered rewards, and spoken publicly about their ongoing grief. For them, the pain lies not only in the loss but in the absence of closure. Tony was declared legally dead in 1989, but without a body, the family has no grave to visit, no place to lay flowers. The case remains officially unsolved, open in the hope that one day, new evidence or testimony will emerge. Reflections: The disappearance of Tony Jones is more than a missing person case. It is a story of youth and possibility cut short, of a family's endurance, and of a road that holds too many secrets. On that November night in 1982, Tony set out with nothing more than a backpack and trust in the kindness of strangers. Somewhere along the highway, that trust was betrayed. Was he taken by a predator? Was his life ended in a random act of violence? Or does someone still carry the truth, unspoken, after all these years? The Flinders Highway stretches on, long, empty, and silent. And along its edges lingers the memory of Tony Jones, a traveler who vanished into the Australian night, leaving behind a mystery that refuses to fade. The disappearance of Peter Falconio. It begins on a long, empty highway in the Australian outback. A young couple traveling under the stars. A roadside encounter that turned into a nightmare. His name was Peter Falconio, a British backpacker who vanished in July 2001. What happened on that desert highway remains one of Australia's most infamous mysteries. A journey through Australia. Peter Falconio was born in 1973 in Hepworth, West Yorkshire, England. At 28 years old, he was adventurous, energetic, and eager to see the world. In 2001, he and his girlfriend, Joanne Lees, set out on a backpacking trip across Australia. They traveled by van, exploring the vast landscapes of the outback. For the couple, it was meant to be the trip of a lifetime, a chance to see the raw beauty of one of the world's most remote frontiers. But the outback, with its long stretches of unlit road and sparse population, held dangers as well as wonders. The night of July 14, 2001. On the evening of July 14, Peter and Joanne were driving along the Stewart Highway, near Barrow Creek in the Northern Territory. A car pulled alongside them, flashing its lights. The driver gestured for them to pull over, suggesting there might be a problem with their van. Peter stopped. He got out to speak with the man. Joanne stayed inside. Moments later, she heard what sounded like a gunshot. The stranger forced Joanne into his vehicle, tying her hands and covering her head. But in a desperate act of courage, she escaped, running into the bush and hiding for hours until the attacker gave up the search. When Joanne emerged, Peter was gone. He has never been seen again. The search for Peter. Police launched an immediate investigation. Roadblocks were set up along the Stewart Highway. Search teams scoured the area for days. They found evidence of a struggle. Peter's blood was discovered near the van, suggesting he had been wounded. Joanne's account of the attack was consistent, though with few witnesses and little physical evidence, investigators faced challenges. The vastness of the outback made the search nearly impossible. In that empty desert, a body or a weapon could be hidden forever. Despite exhaustive efforts, no trace of Peter was ever found. A suspect emerges in the months that followed. Suspicion fell on Bradley John Murdoch, a drifter and mechanic with a violent past. Murdoch fit Joanne's description of the attacker: tall, lean, with long hair tied back. He also owned a white four-wheel drive vehicle similar to the one she described. DNA testing later revealed traces of Murdoch's genetic material on Joanne Lees's clothing and inside her restraints. This evidence linked him directly to the attack. Murdoch was arrested in 2003 and charged with Peter Falconio's murder, as well as the abduction of Joanne Lees. The trial took place in Darwin in 2005 and captured global attention. Joanne Lees testified in detail about the night of the attack. She described the terror of being bound, the desperation of her escape, and the horror of losing Peter. The prosecution argued that Murdoch had ambushed the couple, shot Falconio, and disposed of his body somewhere in the vast desert. They pointed to the DNA evidence as proof of his involvement. The defense countered that the case was circumstantial. There was no body, no weapon, and no direct proof that Falconio was dead. They argued that the DNA evidence could have been contaminated or misinterpreted. Despite the uncertainties, the jury found Bradley John Murdoch guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum of 28 years before parole. The unanswered question. Even with the conviction, one haunting question remains: where is Peter Falconio? Without a body, his fate is not definitively known. Murdoch has never confessed, never revealed a location, and continues to deny involvement. The Northern Territory Police have conducted multiple searches over the years, following new leads and tips. But the vast desert has kept its silence. For Peter's family, the lack of remains has meant no closure, no final resting place. They accepted the court's verdict but still long for the truth about what happened that night. Theories and speculation. 1. Murder and concealment. The accepted theory is that Murdoch killed Falconio during the roadside encounter, then hid or buried his body in the remote bushland. With hundreds of miles of empty terrain, concealment would have been tragically easy. 2. Survived, but disappeared. A fringe theory suggests Falconio may not have been killed but instead taken elsewhere. This idea, however, has no evidence, and the blood found at the scene strongly indicates otherwise. 3. Unsolved mysteries of the outback. Some argue that while Murdoch was rightly convicted, the full details of the night may never be known. Did Falconio die instantly? Was his body transported far from the scene? The desert, vast and indifferent, keeps the answers hidden. The legacy of the case. The disappearance of Peter Falconio became one of the most widely reported true crime stories of the early 2000s. It raised awareness about the risks of remote travel, especially for backpackers in isolated regions. For Joanne Lees, survival came at the cost of trauma. She later wrote a memoir recounting her ordeal, insisting that the conviction gave her a measure of justice but not peace. For Falconio's family, the pain endures. They continue to hope that one day his remains will be found, bringing an end to decades of uncertainty. Reflections. The story of Peter Falconio is not just about a crime. It is about the fragile line between safety and danger on the open road. A young man, full of life and dreams, vanished on a highway beneath the Australian night sky. His partner lived to tell the tale, but the man himself left no trace. Conviction brought accountability. But the mystery remains unsolved in its most human sense: a family without answers, a body never recovered, and a silence across the desert that has lasted more than 20 years. On the Stuart Highway, the trucks still pass, the sun still sets, and the night remains as vast and indifferent as ever. And somewhere within that expanse lingers the memory of Peter Falconio, a traveler lost to the outback, his story unfinished, his fate still a question carried on the wind. Romain Gary, the disappearance that wasn't. It begins not with a vanishing on a lonely road or a body lost at sea, but with the vanishing of an identity. The man was Romain Gary, diplomat, war hero, novelist, and one of France's most celebrated literary figures of the 20th century. In the 1970s, he seemed to disappear, replaced by another writer who emerged suddenly with dazzling success. The mystery was not of a missing person, but of a missing name. For years, no one suspected the truth. A man of many lives, Romain Gary was born Roman Casu in 1914 in Vilnius, then part of the Russian Empire. He grew up in France, reinventing himself with a new name as he entered adulthood. His early life was already a story of transformation. He fought in the Free French Air Force during World War II, becoming a decorated pilot. After the war, he served as a diplomat, representing France in international posts from Sofia to Los Angeles. At the same time, he wrote novels. His first major work, Education Européenne, 1945, drew on his war experiences and won critical acclaim. By the 1950s and 60s, Gary was one of France's literary stars, admired for his wit, imagination, and satirical eye. But with fame came pressure. Critics who once celebrated him began to dismiss his later works as tired, repetitive, or out of touch. The man who had been hailed as a genius now faced whispers that his best days were behind him. The mysterious appearance of Émile Ajar in 1974, a new literary voice appeared in France, Émile Ajar. His debut novel, Gros Colline, was fresh, eccentric, and playful, unlike the polished style associated with Romain Gary. Critics praised it as the arrival of a bold young writer, a voice of a new generation. Over the next few years, Émile Ajar published more novels, each wildly different from Gary's earlier work. The most famous, La Vie Devant Soi, 1975, told the story of a young Arab boy and his caretaker, Madame Rosa. It was hailed as a masterpiece of compassion and humanity. In 1975, La Vie Devant Soi won the Prix Goncourt, France's most prestigious literary award. The catch? The rules of the Prix Goncourt allow a writer to win only once. Romain Gary had already won the prize in 1956 for Les Racines du Ciel. And so, without realizing it, the jury had awarded the same man the prize twice. The disappearance of Romain Gary. As Émile Ajar rose, Romain Gary seemed to fade. His books sold less, his reputation dimmed. It was as if the old master had been replaced by the new star. The public believed Gary was in decline, while Ajar was hailed as a revelation. The literary establishment even compared the two, often at Gary's expense. In truth, Gary had orchestrated the entire illusion. Émile Ajar was a pseudonym, a mask he had created to escape the weight of his own fame. To make the deception convincing, he enlisted his young cousin Paul Pavlovich to impersonate Ajar in public, attending events and giving interviews. For years, no one suspected. Gary had disappeared in plain sight, hiding behind the success of a name that wasn't his. The psychological game. Why did Romain Gary create Émile Ajar? Partly, it was rebellion. He resented the way critics had pigeonholed him. By writing under a new name, he could reinvent himself, free from expectation. Partly, it was mischief. Gary delighted in trickery, in exposing the pretensions of the literary world. The idea that critics mocked Romain Gary while praising Émile Ajar, not knowing they were the same man, amused him deeply. But there was also melancholy in the act. Gary once said, "Literature is a contract between a man and the world. But sometimes, you need to break the contract and start again." In creating Ajar, he both disappeared and was reborn. Unmasking the truth. For the rest of the 1970s, the masquerade continued. Ajar's novels flourished, Gary maintained the secret, and Pavlovich played his role convincingly. But the deception grew heavy. Pavlovich later admitted the charade caused tension and fear, as suspicion occasionally surfaced. On December 2, 1980, Romain Gary ended his life in Paris, leaving behind a final note that revealed the truth. In it, he confessed that he and Émile Ajar were one and the same. The revelation stunned France. The disappearance of Romain Gary had been a literary illusion, one of the greatest hoaxes in modern literature. He had fooled critics, readers, and even the Prix Goncourt itself. Legacy of the disappearance. Today, Romain Gary is remembered not only as a gifted writer but also as a master of reinvention. He remains the only author to win the Prix Goncourt twice, though technically forbidden, once as himself, once under his alter ego. His disappearance as Romain Gary and reappearance as Émile Ajar blurred the lines between life, art, and identity. It was both a deception and a masterpiece. Some see it as an act of liberation, others as a cry of despair. Perhaps it was both, a final trick played by a man who lived his life in many masks. Reflections. The story of Romain Gary is unlike the vanishings of explorers or travelers. He did not vanish into wilderness or sea. He vanished into words, into the invention of another self. His disappearance was not a loss of life, but a disappearance of identity, a deliberate shedding of one name to inhabit another. And yet, it leaves us with questions as haunting as any physical mystery. Where does the writer end and the invention begin? Can a man truly disappear into his own creation? In the case of Romain Gary, the answer is both yes and no. He disappeared as himself, only to return as someone else, until, in the end, both names belonged to the same silence. The mystery of Captain Thomas Mantell. It begins on a clear afternoon over the skies of Kentucky. A pilot in pursuit, a mysterious object in the distance, and a sudden, fatal plunge to Earth. His name was Captain Thomas Mantell, a decorated World War II veteran and experienced aviator. On January 7, 1948, he died while chasing an unidentified flying object. His death became one of the earliest and most famous cases in America's UFO history. A hero of the air, Thomas Francis Mantell Jr. was born in 1922 in Louisville, Kentucky. From a young age, he dreamed of the skies. During World War II, he flew transport planes for the U.S. Army Air Forces, earning distinction for his skill and bravery. By 1948, at just 25 years old, Mantell had logged over 2,000 flight hours. He was a respected officer in the Kentucky Air National Guard, flying the new P-51 Mustang fighter, a plane that had helped secure Allied victory just a few years earlier. By all accounts, Mantell was disciplined, level-headed, and highly capable. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. The sightings begin on January 7, 1948, the airwaves lit up with unusual reports. At around 1:15 p.m., the Kentucky State Highway Patrol received calls from citizens describing a large, circular object in the sky near Maysville, Kentucky. It was said to be enormous, metallic, and moving slowly at high altitude. By 1:45 p.m., air traffic controllers at Godman Army Airfield, near Fort Knox, spotted the object from their tower. They described it as a shiny, round craft, hanging in the sky, unlike any conventional aircraft. It was broad daylight. Dozens of witnesses, both civilian and military, watched the object hover. The base scrambled fighters to investigate. Among them was Captain Thomas Mantell. The pursuit. Mantell was leading a flight of 4 P-51 Mustangs returning from a mission in Georgia. At 2:45 p.m., they were redirected to intercept the unidentified object. As the planes climbed, ground control tracked both the object and the pursuing fighters. Mantell reported seeing it, a vast, metallic object, reflecting sunlight, moving steadily but out of reach. He described it as tremendous in size, directly ahead and above me. His wingmen, struggling with fuel and oxygen limits, eventually turned back. But Mantell continued the chase, climbing higher into the thin air. At 3:15 p.m., radio contact with Mantell broke off. Minutes later, his plane went into a fatal dive and crashed near Franklin, Kentucky. The aftermath rescue teams reached the wreckage quickly. Mantell's body was found inside. The aircraft was destroyed, scattered across a field. There were no signs of combat, no evidence of mid-air collision. The official cause of death was hypoxia, lack of oxygen at high altitude. Mantell's P-51 had no pressurized cabin and no supplemental oxygen system for extreme altitudes. The young pilot had likely blacked out while pursuing the object, his plane climbing until it stalled and spiraled down. But that left the bigger question: what exactly was he chasing? Explanations and theories. 1. The skyhook balloon. The U.S. Air Force later concluded that Mantell had been pursuing a skyhook balloon, a classified Navy project involving large, high-altitude balloons used for scientific research. These balloons, made of reflective material and capable of reaching over 60,000 feet, could appear enormous and metallic. At the time, however, the project was secret, and most military personnel had never heard of it. If Mantell encountered such a balloon, he may have mistaken it for something extraordinary. 2. Venus. Early press releases speculated the object might have been the planet Venus, visible that afternoon. But this theory was quickly dismissed. Mantell was an experienced pilot, unlikely to confuse a planet with a massive airborne craft visible from multiple locations. 3. Experimental aircraft. Some researchers suggested Mantell may have encountered an experimental military plane or balloon unknown even to local controllers. The late 1940s were a period of rapid aviation experimentation in the United States. 4. UFO hypothesis. For UFO enthusiasts, Mantell's death remains a cornerstone case. Multiple witnesses described the object as massive, metallic, and unlike any balloon. They insist Mantell died while in pursuit of something genuinely unidentified, possibly extraterrestrial. Public reaction. Mantell's death made headlines worldwide. A decorated pilot, dead in pursuit of a UFO, in broad daylight, with military witnesses. It was the kind of story that fueled both fascination and fear. For many, it was the first time UFOs were taken seriously as a national issue. The incident contributed to the establishment of Project Sign, the U.S. Air Force's first official program to investigate UFO sightings. Project Sign initially leaned toward an extraterrestrial hypothesis, before later programs, like Project Blue Book, adopted more cautious explanations. The human side beyond the theories and investigations, the loss was deeply personal. Mantell left behind his wife, Peggy, and 3 young children. To them, he was not a symbol of UFO mystery, but a husband and father whose life ended too soon. For the community, his death turned him into both a hero and a tragic figure, a man whose professionalism led him to chase the unknown, at the cost of his life. Legacy today, the Mantell incident is remembered as one of the most important UFO cases in history. It marked the first time a pilot died while actively pursuing an unidentified object. The Air Force's skyhook balloon explanation remains the official account, but doubts linger. Witnesses insisted the object was unlike anything they had ever seen. Skeptics argue the balloon theory fits the available facts. Believers argue it explains too little. The truth remains uncertain. Reflections: the disappearance of Captain Thomas Mantell was not into the sea, the wilderness, or the shadows of crime, but into the unknown skies themselves. Did he die chasing a secret military balloon, the light of Venus, or something stranger still? His final words, describing an object tremendous in size, echo across decades of debate. On that clear January afternoon in 1948, Captain Thomas Mantell became a symbol of courage, of tragedy, and of the enduring mystery of the skies. The disappearance of Jim Sullivan. It begins with a car abandoned on the edge of the desert. Inside, a wallet, clothes, and a box of unsold records. But the man himself was gone. His name was Jim Sullivan, a singer-songwriter with a voice full of longing, and a career that never quite found its place. In March 1975, he disappeared without a trace in New Mexico. Nearly 50 years later, his fate remains a haunting mystery. A musician with a voice of the desert, Jim Sullivan was born in Nebraska in 1940 and raised in California. From an early age, he was drawn to music, teaching himself guitar and developing a style that blended folk, rock, and a touch of the cosmic. By the late 1960s, Sullivan had made his way into Los Angeles's music scene. Tall, charismatic, and soft-spoken, he fit naturally among the dreamers and drifters who filled the city's bars and recording studios. In 1969, he released his debut album, UFO. The record was unlike anything else at the time. Sparse, moody arrangements carried by Sullivan's deep, haunting voice. His lyrics spoke of highways, loneliness, and strange encounters beneath the stars. The title track, UFO, hinted at alien abduction, at leaving this world behind. The album failed commercially. But decades later, it would become a cult classic, partly because of what happened next. Searching for an audience through the early 1970s, Sullivan kept performing, hoping for a breakthrough. He had brushes with success, playing clubs in Los Angeles, meeting well-known musicians, even appearing in the 1967 film Easy Rider as an extra. But fame eluded him. By 1975, he was frustrated. His marriage was strained, his finances unstable, and his career stagnant. He decided to leave California and try his luck in Nashville, Tennessee, the heart of country and songwriting. It was a fresh start. Or so he hoped. The road to New Mexico. On March 4, 1975, Jim Sullivan packed his Volkswagen Beetle with personal belongings and boxes of his UFO album. He said goodbye to his wife and young son, then set out eastward, alone. He drove through Arizona and into New Mexico. Somewhere along that lonely stretch of road, the trail grew strange. Santa Rosa, New Mexico. On March 5, Sullivan checked into the La Mesa Motel in Santa Rosa, a small town along Interstate 40. Witnesses recalled him appearing restless, pacing, and drinking. He paid for the room but never slept in it. Instead, he left the key inside and drove away. Later that day, his car was found abandoned at a ranch outside town. Inside were his wallet, guitar, clothes, and all of his possessions. Everything he needed for the journey was left behind. But Jim Sullivan was gone. Local authorities launched a search of the area. Ranch land and desert scrub were combed by deputies and volunteers. No body was found. No evidence of foul play. No sign of a man wandering into the desert. The official report concluded that Sullivan had vanished, but into what, no one could say. Theories of disappearance. 1. Voluntary vanishing. Some believe Sullivan walked away from his life, choosing to disappear. But his abandoned car, wallet, and guitar argue against this. If he wanted a new start, why leave behind everything that mattered? 2. Foul play. Others suggest he may have met with violence. Santa Rosa lay on remote highways where accidents and crime were not uncommon. Could he have encountered someone dangerous after leaving the motel? 3. Disoriented wanderer. Another theory is that Sullivan, exhausted and possibly intoxicated, walked into the desert and succumbed to exposure. But no remains were ever recovered, unusual, given the scale of the search. 4. Alien abduction. Because of the eerie parallels between Sullivan's disappearance and the themes of his album UFO, some fans have speculated, half seriously, that he was taken. In the title track, he sang about leaving on a spaceship, about not being believed. The lyrics now feel like prophecy. While few take this literally, the coincidence has deepened the myth of his disappearance. The album that predicted it all. Part of what keeps Jim Sullivan's case alive is the album he left behind. UFO, overlooked at its release, is now regarded as an underground masterpiece. Its themes of departure, loneliness, and escape seem uncannily aligned with Sullivan's fate. Lines about walking into the desert and leaving without a trace echo eerily against the facts of his disappearance. Did Sullivan sense his own fate? Or do we simply project meaning onto lyrics in hindsight? Either way, the album transformed from obscurity into legend. Family and aftermath. For Sullivan's family, the disappearance was devastating. His wife Barbara and their son Chris waited for news that never came. With no evidence of death, they were left in limbo. Decades later, Sullivan's story resurfaced when reissues of UFO introduced his music to new listeners. Critics praised its originality, and musicians cited it as an influence. But alongside admiration came renewed fascination with his disappearance. Every mention of his name carried the shadow of the unsolved mystery. Reflections. The disappearance of Jim Sullivan blurs the line between art and life, myth and reality. A man who sang of escape, of other worlds, of vanishing into the unknown, ended up vanishing himself. Did he die quietly in the desert, his body lost to the elements? Was he the victim of chance violence on a lonely highway? Or did his music, in some strange way, foreshadow the destiny he could never escape? The desert around Santa Rosa remains silent. His car, his belongings, and his songs are all that remain. Jim Sullivan is gone. But his voice, deep, haunting, filled with longing, continues to carry across the years.
The disappearance of Heinrich Müller. It begins in the ruins of Berlin, 1945. The Third Reich collapsing, the Soviet army closing in, and the leaders of Nazi Germany scattering, hiding, or taking their own lives. Among them was Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, master of secret police operations, and one of the most feared men of the regime. Unlike many others, he was never captured, never put on trial, and never confirmed dead. To this day, his fate remains one of the great mysteries of World War II. The rise of a policeman. Heinrich Müller was born in 1900 in Munich, Germany. After World War I, he joined the Bavarian police. His skill in handling political cases, particularly investigations against communists, drew the attention of rising Nazi leaders. By 1934, Müller had transferred to the Gestapo, the secret state police under Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich. Cold, efficient, and utterly loyal, Müller rose quickly. He became chief of the Gestapo in 1939. His office was responsible for political policing, counterintelligence, and the suppression of resistance. Nicknamed Gestapo Müller, he was feared not only by enemies of the Reich but sometimes even by fellow Nazis. The machinery of terror under Müller's command, the Gestapo became central to Nazi repression. He oversaw networks of informants, interrogations, and the crushing of resistance across occupied Europe. His name appears in documents authorizing mass arrests, deportations, and executions. Müller was also directly connected to the Holocaust. He attended the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, where Nazi officials coordinated the final solution. He tracked the progress of extermination through reports sent to his office. Unlike many Nazi officials, Müller was not known for ideology. Colleagues described him as a career policeman, pragmatic, ruthless, and indifferent. His loyalty was to power and efficiency, not belief. The final days of the Reich in April 1945, as the Red Army closed in on Berlin, Müller remained at his post in the Reich Chancellery. Witnesses reported seeing him in the Führerbunker as Hitler's inner circle collapsed. On April 29, the day before Hitler's suicide, Müller told colleagues he would not surrender. According to one account, he said, "I have never shot myself with a pistol in my life, nor shall I do so now. If I am taken, I know what will happen to me." After that, Heinrich Müller vanished. The hunt begins in the years immediately after the war. Allied forces searched for Müller. The Soviets, who had captured Berlin, claimed no knowledge of his fate. Some believed they had taken him, as they had with other high-ranking Nazis. But no proof emerged. The Americans, who employed many former Nazis in intelligence operations against the Soviet Union, also investigated. They never found Müller, despite extensive searches. The question haunted investigators: how could one of the most powerful figures of the Nazi regime disappear so completely? Theories of Fate 1. Death in Berlin. The most common explanation is that Müller died during the final days of the Battle of Berlin. Some reports suggest he was killed while attempting to break out of the city. Others claimed his body was found near the Chancellery and buried in a mass grave. But no remains were ever conclusively identified as his. 2. Soviet capture. Another theory is that Müller was taken alive by the Soviets. Given his intelligence value, as head of the Gestapo, he knew vast amounts about Nazi operations, resistance networks, and espionage. He would have been a prized asset. Some defectors later claimed Müller worked for Soviet intelligence after the war. Yet no documents have confirmed this. 3. Escape to South America. Like other Nazis, Müller may have fled Europe through escape routes to Argentina, Chile, or Brazil. Over the decades, alleged sightings of Müller surfaced across South America. None were verified. Skeptics note that Müller had no strong personal connections to these escape networks, making such a flight less likely. 4. Hidden by the West. Another possibility is that the Americans or West Germans secretly recruited Müller after the war, as they did with other Nazi officials under programs like Operation Paperclip. His expertise in counterintelligence would have been valuable in the Cold War. But unlike others, Müller's name never surfaced in declassified recruitment files. Archival clues. Over the decades, researchers have combed archives for answers. In 1963, West German investigators claimed that Müller had been buried in a Berlin cemetery in May 1945. But when the grave was exhumed, the remains belonged to 3 different men, none of them Müller. In the 1990s, declassified CIA documents revealed that American intelligence had pursued leads on Müller for years, in Czechoslovakia, in Latin America, even in the Middle East. None proved conclusive. The CIA's final assessment in 1971 concluded, there is no evidence Heinrich Müller survived the war. His grave, however, has never been found. The shadow of absence. The mystery of Heinrich Müller endures not only because of the uncertainty, but because of what he represented. He was one of the very few top Nazis never captured, tried, or confirmed dead. While Himmler committed suicide and Eichmann was captured in Argentina, Müller simply vanished. For survivors of the Holocaust and for historians, the absence of justice was a bitter wound. A man who orchestrated terror on such a scale disappeared into silence. Legacy of fear and silence today, Heinrich Müller remains a symbol of the unanswered questions of World War II. If he died in Berlin, he became one more casualty of a collapsing regime, his body lost in the rubble. If he escaped, he may have lived in hiding, a ghost of the Reich. If he was captured, he may have spent his final years serving another power, his crimes unpunished. None of these possibilities can be proven. Each keeps the mystery alive. Reflections. The disappearance of Heinrich Müller is not the story of an adventurer lost at sea or a musician gone into myth. It is the story of a man at the center of history's darkest crimes, slipping beyond the reach of justice. In the ruins of Berlin, in the archives of Moscow and Washington, in rumors from South America, his shadow lingers. Was he buried nameless in the rubble? Did he live out his life under another flag? Or does the silence hide a truth too inconvenient to reveal? The answers remain hidden, like Müller himself, in the dark spaces where history and myth converge.
The disappearance of Bruno Borges. It begins in a quiet city in northern Brazil. A young man vanishes from his family home, leaving behind a locked room covered in cryptic symbols, strange paintings, and dozens of handwritten books. His name was Bruno Borges, a psychology student with a fascination for philosophy, the occult, and extraterrestrial life. In March 2017, he disappeared, sparking international headlines. What followed was part mystery, part performance, and part puzzle, a story where the line between truth and illusion blurred. A young seeker, Bruno Borges, was born in 1992 in Rio Branco, the capital of Acre, Brazil. By his mid-20s, he was studying psychology, but his interests stretched far beyond textbooks. He immersed himself in philosophy, quoting thinkers like Giordano Bruno and Immanuel Kant. He was drawn to questions of existence, contact with extraterrestrials, and the pursuit of hidden knowledge. Friends and family described him as intelligent but intensely private. He spent long hours alone, writing and sketching. To some, he seemed eccentric. To others, brilliant. By 2017, he had begun a project so unusual that even those closest to him could not have anticipated its scope. The vanishing. On March 27, 2017, Bruno was last seen at his family's home. When relatives entered his locked bedroom, they found something astonishing. The walls, floor, and ceiling were covered with writings and symbols painted in red ink, thousands of characters, most in a cipher resembling runes. In the center of the room stood a statue of the 16th-century philosopher Giordano Bruno, valued at thousands of dollars. Surrounding it were 14 handwritten books, meticulously bound, each filled with encrypted text. On his desk, a framed message read, "Whoever follows the steps I have taken will receive the answers to all questions humanity has asked." But Bruno himself was gone. Public reaction. News of the disappearance spread quickly. Photographs of the strange room went viral, and the story was soon covered by international media. Some called it the Brazilian Da Vinci Code. Others compared it to a real-life mystery novel. Speculation surged. Was Bruno abducted? Did he leave voluntarily on a secret quest? Was he hiding from something, or preparing for contact with extraterrestrials? The encrypted books became the focus of fascination. Codebreakers and amateur cryptologists around the world tried to decipher his system. Some succeeded in partially translating the text, which revealed passages on self-knowledge, morality, and philosophical thought. But none of it explained where Bruno had gone. The investigation police in Acre launched an investigation. At first, foul play was not ruled out. But the evidence suggested careful planning. Security cameras captured Bruno walking calmly through the streets on the day he disappeared, carrying a backpack. He showed no signs of distress. Interviews with friends revealed that Bruno had been working on his secret writings for several years. He had even borrowed money to fund the creation of the Giordano Bruno statue. It became clear that his disappearance was part of a larger design, an orchestrated act rather than a crime. The return 4 months later, in August 2017, Bruno Borges returned home. Thin, unshaven, but otherwise healthy, he offered no clear explanation. He said he had needed time for reflection and that his writings were part of a lifelong philosophical project. He denied that his disappearance had been a hoax, though many accused him of staging the event for publicity. The mystery had made him famous, his encrypted books soon drew commercial interest. Yet Bruno remained enigmatic. He never fully explained where he had been during those 4 months, nor why he had chosen to vanish so dramatically. Theories of the case 1. A publicity stunt. Some critics argue Bruno's disappearance was a deliberate stunt to market his books. The dramatic room, the cryptic writings, and the media frenzy created instant notoriety. His return and subsequent book releases seem to support this theory. 2. A spiritual quest. Others believe Bruno was sincere in his search for higher truth. His disappearance may have been a kind of retreat, a period of solitude meant to mirror the journeys of mystics and philosophers. The elaborate room was his way of leaving behind a symbolic map for others to follow. 3. Mental health struggles. Psychologists have suggested Bruno may have been experiencing a mental health crisis, with his disappearance reflecting a break from reality. The murder of Gregory Villemin. It begins on a cold autumn afternoon in the Vosges Mountains of France. A child is reported missing. Hours later, his body is discovered in the waters of a nearby river, bound and lifeless. His name was Gregory Villemin. He was just 4 years old when, on October 16, 1984, he became the victim of one of the most infamous and enduring criminal mysteries in French history. A family in the Vosges. The Villemin family lived in the small village of Lepangy-sur-Vallon. Jean-Marie Villemin, Gregory's father, worked as a foreman in a local factory. By the standards of the area, the Villemins were doing well, a young couple with a modest home, respected in their community, proud parents of a healthy boy. But behind the quiet surface of village life, tension had been building. For several years, the Villemin family had been receiving anonymous letters and phone calls from a mysterious figure known only as the Crow. The Crow's messages were filled with insults, threats, and detailed knowledge of the family's private life. He seemed to know their routines, their quarrels, their secrets. The harassment terrified the Villemins, but they could never identify who was behind it. Then, in October 1984, the threats became reality. The day of the disappearance, on the afternoon of October 16, 4-year-old Gregory was playing outside the family home. His mother, Christine, stepped away briefly. When she returned, the boy was gone. At 5 p.m., a chilling phone call came to Gregory's uncle. The voice of the Crow declared, "I have taken the boy. I have drowned him in the Vallon." A desperate search began immediately. Hours later, Gregory's body was found in the river, his hands and feet bound with rope, still dressed in his little winter coat. The village was stunned. What had once been menacing letters was now murder. The investigation begins. Police descended on the small community. The Crow's long history of threats gave investigators a starting point, but the case soon became one of the most tangled in French legal history. Suspicion first fell on members of the Villemin family itself. Handwriting experts compared letters from the Crow to family samples. Cousins, uncles, and even Christine, Gregory's mother, came under scrutiny. The case gripped France. Newspapers splashed headlines daily, while television coverage turned the tragedy into a national obsession. The small village became the stage for a drama of suspicion, jealousy, and betrayal. A family divided. The investigation quickly exposed divisions within the extended Villemin family. Jean-Marie, Gregory's father, had risen socially as a foreman, something that reportedly stirred resentment among relatives. Police arrested Bernard Laroche, a cousin, after handwriting analysis suggested similarities between his writing and the Crow's letters. A young relative, Muriel, initially claimed she had seen Laroche abduct Gregory, but later recanted. Released from custody, Laroche was nonetheless branded guilty in the public eye. Then, in March 1985, Jean-Marie Villemin took justice into his own hands. Convinced Laroche had killed his son, he shot him dead with a hunting rifle. The murder shocked France, further complicating an already chaotic case. Christine Villemin accused in 1985, the case took an even more dramatic turn. Gregory's mother, Christine, was formally charged with his murder after investigators argued her handwriting matched the crow's letters. But the accusation collapsed in 1993 when Christine was fully cleared of all suspicion. She had been wrongly accused, adding another tragic layer to the family's suffering. Decades of confusion. For years, the case stalled. Competing handwriting analyses, conflicting testimonies, and errors by investigators left the truth buried under contradictions. The crow's letters and phone calls, however, continued to haunt the family and the investigation. They revealed an intimate knowledge of the Villemins' daily life that suggested the culprit was someone close to them, perhaps within the family itself. But no definitive suspect ever stood trial for Gregory's murder. Renewed investigations in the 2000s, advances in DNA analysis offered new hope. Forensic experts tested the ropes that had bound Gregory and other preserved evidence. But results were inconclusive. In 2017, investigators launched a renewed effort, analyzing the letters with modern techniques. They identified DNA fragments from multiple people, but none provided the breakthrough they needed. At the same time, police re-examined the extended Villemin family. Several relatives were placed under formal investigation, accused of complicity in the murder, though charges were later dropped for lack of evidence. Despite decades of effort, the case remains officially unsolved. Theories and suspicions. 1. A family feud turned deadly. The most widely accepted theory is that Gregory's murder was the result of jealousy within the Villemin family. Resentment toward Jean-Marie's success may have fueled hatred, expressed through the anonymous harassment and culminating in the child's death. 2. Bernard Laroche as culprit. Some still believe Laroche was guilty, despite his denial and the collapse of the case against him. Jean-Marie's vigilante act reflected this belief, though Laroche's guilt has never been proven. 3. A wider conspiracy. Another theory suggests that multiple family members collaborated, with some sending letters while others acted in violence. The DNA traces from several individuals seem to support this idea, though no unified narrative has emerged. 4. An outsider. A minority view holds that an outsider, someone beyond the family circle, committed the crime, though the intimate knowledge shown in the crow's letters makes this unlikely. The impact on France. The murder of Gregory Villemin became more than a crime. It was a national obsession. For years, every development was front-page news. The story revealed not just a family's tragedy but also the deep divisions and rivalries of village life. The case also exposed flaws in the French justice system, premature accusations, mishandled evidence, and trials by media. It remains a cautionary tale of how justice can falter under pressure. Reflections. The story of Gregory Villemin is one of innocence lost, not only in the life of a 4-year-old boy but in the faith of a nation that justice would prevail. Was the killer a resentful relative? A jealous cousin? A conspiracy within the family? Or someone never truly considered? Decades later, the Valognes River still carries the weight of that October evening. The letters of the crow remain chilling reminders of a crime that tore a family apart. And the name of Gregory Villemin endures, not only as a victim, but as the center of a mystery that continues to haunt France. The disappearance of Adrian McNaughton. It begins on the shore of a quiet lake in eastern Ontario. A child plays near the water, surrounded by family and friends. Moments later, he is gone. His name was Adrian McNaughton, just 5 years old when he vanished in June 1972. Despite one of the largest searches in Canadian history, no trace of him was ever found. His disappearance remains one of Canada's most haunting unsolved mysteries. A summer day at the lake on June 12, 1972, Adrian McNaughton joined his father and 4 siblings for a fishing trip at Holmes Lake, near the small town of Calabagie, Ontario. Adrian was described as quiet and thoughtful, a little boy with bright blonde hair and a shy demeanor. For his family, it was an ordinary summer outing, the kind they had enjoyed many times before. That afternoon, as the others fished, Adrian grew restless. He wandered away from the shoreline, playing near a small rise of land dotted with trees and brush. He was only a short distance from his family. But when they looked again, he was gone. The search begins. Panic spread quickly. Adrian's father and siblings searched the immediate area, calling his name. Neighbors and local volunteers soon joined. By evening, the Ontario Provincial Police were on scene. Over the next several days, more than 5,000 searchers combed the forest, lake, and surrounding terrain. The search included helicopters, divers, tracking dogs, and military assistance. They scoured every trail, drained sections of the lake, and searched underwater with sonar. Yet nothing was found, no clothing, no footprints, no body. It was as though Adrian had vanished into thin air. Theories of disappearance. 1. Accidental drowning. The most immediate theory was that Adrian had fallen into Holmes Lake and drowned. But repeated dives and sonar sweeps found nothing. Given the scale of the water search, investigators later considered this explanation unlikely. 2. Lost in the wilderness. Another possibility was that Adrian wandered deeper into the dense forest and became lost. But the massive ground search, covering miles of rugged terrain, yielded no trace of him, no torn clothing, no remains, no clues of survival. 3. Abduction. As days passed, the idea of abduction gained traction. Holmes Lake, though remote, was accessible by road. Could someone passing through have taken Adrian while his family's attention was diverted? No witnesses reported strange vehicles or strangers in the area that day. But without physical evidence, investigators could not dismiss the possibility. 4. Foul play. Closer to home. A darker theory suggested involvement by someone within the community or even connected to the family. Police interviewed relatives and locals extensively, but no charges were ever laid. The absence of evidence meant every theory remained speculative. A case that went cold. By late summer 1972, active search efforts slowed. Adrian's disappearance became a cold case. His family lived with unanswered questions. For his parents and siblings, the lack of closure was unbearable. They did not know if Adrian had drowned, been abducted, or suffered another fate. The case faded from headlines but never from memory. In Ontario, Adrian's name became part of local lore, a reminder of how fragile safety can be, even in the company of loved ones. Decades later, new leads. Nearly half a century after Adrian disappeared, the case resurfaced thanks to renewed public interest and modern investigative tools. In 2018, the Canadian podcast Someone Knows Something, hosted by David Ridgen, devoted its 4th season to Adrian's story. The podcast re-examined witness statements, interviewed surviving family members, and even used ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs to search new areas near Holmes Lake. Some promising leads emerged. Search dogs alerted to areas near the lake, suggesting the possible presence of human remains underground. Excavations, however, revealed nothing conclusive. The new investigation revived interest but did not solve the case. Why it resonates. Adrian's disappearance remains deeply unsettling because of its contradictions. He vanished in daylight, within sight of family. Thousands of trained searchers combed the area, yet no evidence surfaced. Decades later, modern technology has still not revealed answers. The case embodies the terror of sudden, unexplained loss, the idea that a child could vanish in moments, leaving no trace behind. The human cost for the McNaughton family. Adrian's disappearance was devastating. His parents endured decades without closure, their lives overshadowed by uncertainty. For his siblings, the memory of that summer day never faded. They grew up haunted by what happened to their brother, and by the sense that answers were always just out of reach. In interviews, they have described the grief not only of loss, but of ambiguity, the inability to bury, to mourn, to know. Reflections. The disappearance of Adrian McNaughton is not just a crime story, nor merely a tale of wilderness misfortune. It is a human tragedy suspended in uncertainty. Did Adrian fall into the waters of Holmes Lake, his body never recovered? Did he wander deeper into the forest, lost beyond the reach of even the most determined search? Or was he taken from the woods, leaving no trace behind? Nearly 50 years later, no one can say for certain. What remains is the enduring image of a 5-year-old boy, blonde-haired and quiet, last seen near the edge of a lake in Ontario, a child who walked into the afternoon and never came back. The disappearance of Louis Le Prince. It begins on a train bound for Paris in the autumn of 1890. A French inventor boards with his luggage, his mind full of plans. He is preparing to travel to England, then to America, where he hopes to unveil a device that will astonish the world. But when the train arrives, he is gone. His name was Louis Le Prince, and his disappearance robbed history of a man many call the true father of cinema. The inventor before Hollywood, Louis M. Augustin Le Prince, was born in 1841 in Metz, France. He studied art, chemistry, and engineering, blending creativity with scientific curiosity. By the 1870s, he had moved to Leeds, England, where he married Elizabeth Whitley, daughter of a prominent family. There, he worked with photography and optics, experimenting with ways to capture motion on film. Le Prince's work predated the inventions of Thomas Edison in America and the Lumière brothers in France. In 1888, he shot what is widely considered the world's first motion picture, Roundhay Garden Scene. The short film, just a few seconds long, shows family members walking in a garden in Leeds. Grainy but undeniable, it was a breakthrough, moving images captured years before cinema's official birth. By 1890, Le Prince was preparing to demonstrate his invention publicly. It could have secured him a place in history as the inventor of motion pictures. Instead, he vanished. The last journey on September 16, 1890, Louis Le Prince boarded a train in Dijon, France. He had been visiting his brother, Albert, and was heading to Paris. Witnesses saw him board the train. His luggage was placed in the compartment. The journey was routine, lasting only a few hours. But when the train arrived in Paris, Le Prince was nowhere to be found. His luggage was gone. His body was gone. It was as if the inventor had disappeared into thin air between two cities. The investigation French authorities searched the route and questioned passengers, but no clues emerged. There were no reports of a man falling from the train, no evidence of robbery or attack. The disappearance baffled investigators. Newspapers speculated on possible explanations, from suicide to kidnapping. His family, meanwhile, was devastated. They had expected him to sail to New York to demonstrate his camera. Instead, they were left with silence. Theories of disappearance. 1. Suicide. Some suggested that Le Prince, overwhelmed by financial struggles and family pressure, may have taken his own life. But his relatives rejected this, noting his excitement about his invention and his plans for America. 2. Murder for invention. Another theory is that Le Prince was murdered to suppress his invention. At the time, Thomas Edison in the United States and the Lumière brothers in France were developing rival motion picture devices. Some speculate that industrial espionage or sabotage played a role, though no evidence has ever supported this claim. 3. Family conflict. Others point to possible disputes within his family. He had strained relations with some relatives, including disputes over inheritance. Could a family quarrel have played a role in his disappearance? 4. Voluntary disappearance. A minority theory suggests Le Prince deliberately vanished to escape personal or financial pressures. Yet abandoning his work at the brink of success seems unlikely. 5. Accident. Some historians argue he may have fallen from the train unnoticed, his body lost along the route. But given the search conducted, this remains puzzling. The shadow of Edison. One of the most persistent suspicions revolves around Thomas Edison. In the years after Le Prince's disappearance, Edison claimed patents for motion picture technology and is often credited with the invention of cinema. Le Prince's family later accused Edison of stealing ideas and suppressing Le Prince's legacy. In fact, during a 1898 legal battle over motion picture patents, Le Prince's work was cited as evidence against Edison. Though no proof connects Edison to Le Prince's disappearance, the coincidence of timing, on the eve of Le Prince's American debut, has fueled speculation ever since. The widow's fight after his disappearance, Loprince's widow, Elizabeth, and their son, Adolphe, campaigned to secure his recognition as the true inventor of cinema. They exhibited his camera and films, demonstrating that Loprince had captured moving images before Edison or the Lumières. But tragedy followed the family. In 1902, Adolphe Loprince, who had been defending his father's legacy in court, was found dead under mysterious circumstances in New York. Officially ruled a suicide, his death only deepened the sense of conspiracy surrounding the family. Modern discoveries for over a century, Louis Loprince's fate remained a blank page in history. In 2003, a photograph was discovered in the Paris police archives, showing a drowned man pulled from the Seine around the time of Loprince's disappearance. Some speculated it could be him, suggesting an accident or suicide. But the identification was never confirmed. Historians remain divided. Without a body, without belongings, without witnesses, the truth is still elusive. Legacy. Despite his disappearance, Loprince's surviving films and cameras stand as proof of his achievement. Today, historians increasingly acknowledge him as the pioneer of motion pictures. The Roundhay Garden scene, just a fragment of film, is preserved as one of cinema's first steps. In museums, his single-lens camera is displayed as a relic of a lost legacy. And yet, his name is still far less known than Edison or the Lumières, a reminder of how history often favors those who control the narrative, not those who first make the discovery. Reflections. The disappearance of Louis Loprince is not only a mystery of a missing man. It is a story of invention, ambition, and the fragile line between glory and oblivion. Did he die in an accident, his body lost to the river or the rails? Was he silenced by rivals threatened by his invention? Or did he choose to vanish, leaving his work incomplete, his name forgotten? What is certain is that cinema, the great art form of the 20th century, might have carried a different name, had Louis Loprince lived to claim his place in history. Instead, he disappeared, leaving behind only fragments of film, a few seconds of life in motion, and a mystery that endures to this day. The Crouch family murders, a Michigan mystery. It begins with a violent winter night in rural Michigan. A storm rages across the Jackson County fields. Inside a farmhouse, a wealthy family sleeps, unaware of the fate that awaits them. By morning, 4 lives have been extinguished. Their names were Jacob Crouch, his daughter Eunice, her husband Henry White, and a guest, Moses Polly. All were found dead in their beds, shot at close range, under a storm's thunderous cover, and the crime has haunted local memory ever since. A family at home. On the night of November 22, 1883, Jacob Crouch, a 74-year-old prosperous farmer living near Jackson, Michigan, was at home with family and a house guest. A fierce storm unleashed hail and rain that masked any sounds of violence. Yet by morning, 4 bodies were discovered, each shot in bed, some more than once. Jacob's daughter Eunice, 8 months pregnant, her husband Henry White, and Moses Polly, a business visitor, were all killed alongside Jacob himself. The savage act left the region reeling. Torn crime scene, a nation's fascination. The household quickly turned into the site of a swirling investigation. Hundreds descended, trampling footprints, moving bodies, and turning the crime house into a spectacle. Authorities noted empty bullet cartridges scattered around beds, and witnesses described a strong scent of chloroform, suggesting victims were incapacitated before being shot. Yet despite the sensational coverage, the case grew cold. A web of suspects. Investigators probed widely. Suspects ranged from household staff, like servant Julia Reese and housekeeper George Bowles, to Jacob's son-in-law, Daniel Holcomb, and his disabled son Judd. Jealousy over an inheritance loomed large. Jacob had reportedly intended most of his estate to go to Eunice and baby. Other suspected outsiders, cowboys, immigrant workers, or thieves, as possible perpetrators. But none of these theories gained traction. Tragedy after tragedy. The fallout was relentless. Daniel Holcomb was shot by Jacob's grieving widower, Jean-Marie, unrelated to the Michigan case, but the incident reflected the volatile atmosphere surrounding the family. The case birthed further tragedies. A suspect's family member died, a man driven mad by guilt shot himself, a witness's husband murdered her. The pursuit of justice became entangled with grief and rumor, an unhappy ending, a haunting legacy. Despite arrests and trials, no one was ever convicted. The farmhouse burned down years later, erasing physical evidence. Over time, the murders slipped into legend. Local tales tell of Eunice's ghost walking to her father's grave every November 22. Why the mystery endures? This case persists not only because of its brutality, but because of its impossibility. A quadruple murder in a rural home during a violent storm, yet no solid leads. Victims killed efficiently, with cartridges and possible chloroform, suggesting planning. Devastated family, vanished suspects, and a crime scene washed away by the passage of time. No resolution ever emerged. Only stories, newspaper reports, rumors, haunted legends, remain. Reflections. The murders of the Crouch family are more than a crime story, they are a window into a rural America's fears, resentments, and secrets during an unsettled period. Was the killing an act of vengeance, jealousy, betrayal? Was it carefully plotted, or opportunistic violence? The truth vanished that stormy night, swallowed not just by the snow and rain, but by time itself. And perhaps that is why the story lives on, not for what we know, but for what we cannot explain, a silent farmhouse, 4 gunshots, and a mystery that refuses to fade. The Mary Celeste, the ghost ship of the Atlantic. It begins with an empty vessel drifting silently across the Atlantic. The sails hang loose, the ropes sway gently with the sea breeze, and the only sound is the steady creak of timber against water. Everything inside suggests life should be present, meals left untouched, belongings neatly stowed, cargo intact. And yet, not a single person remains on board. This is the mystery of the Mary Celeste, a ship whose story has haunted maritime history for more than a century. Setting the stage, a ship and her crew. The Mary Celeste was built in Nova Scotia in 1861, originally christened the Amazon. At first glance, it was an ordinary brigantine, about 100 feet long, a sturdy merchant ship designed to carry cargo across the Atlantic. Over the years, it changed hands, changed names, and eventually came under the ownership of an American consortium led by James H. Winchester. By 1872, she was refitted, renamed the Mary Celeste, and placed under the command of Captain Benjamin Briggs, an experienced and deeply respected sailor. Briggs was 37 years old, known for his discipline, religious devotion, and careful decision-making. He wasn't just leading a voyage of commerce, he was accompanied by his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia. Together with 7 crew members, they set sail from New York Harbor on November 7, 1872, bound for Genoa, Italy. Their cargo was a valuable one, over 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol. The weather at departure was calm. The crew was well chosen, trusted, and in good health. Captain Briggs had written to his mother just before leaving, assuring her that our vessel is in beautiful trim, and that he looked forward to the journey. There was no hint of misfortune on the horizon. Discovery, a drifting enigma. Less than a month later, on December 5, 1872, another ship, the Dei Grazia, spotted a vessel drifting aimlessly between Portugal and the Azores. The crew of the Dei Grazia approached cautiously. As they drew closer, they recognized the name painted across the stern, Mary Celeste. They boarded her, expecting to find survivors, or at least signs of struggle. Instead, they encountered one of the most baffling sights in maritime history. The Mary Celeste was deserted. Her sails were partially set but damaged, flapping loosely. The rigging was frayed in places, though nothing suggested a violent storm. The ship's single lifeboat was missing, apparently lowered carefully into the sea. Inside, conditions were strange but not catastrophic. The ship's cargo was largely intact, though 9 barrels of alcohol were later found to be empty. The crew's belongings, clothing, and even valuables remained untouched. Captain Briggs' cabin was orderly, his logbook up to date until the morning of November 25, 10 days before the discovery. A half-written note, charts, and navigation tools all lay in their proper place. In the galley, provisions for 6 months were still abundant. There was no sign of fire, no evidence of piracy, no clear reason why the crew had abandoned a seaworthy ship. It was, in every sense, a ghost ship. The court inquiry. The Mary Celeste was sailed to Gibraltar, where a formal inquiry began. The British Vice Admiralty Court examined every detail, from the cargo to the state of the sails. Suspicion briefly fell upon the crew of the Dei Grazia, as some speculated they may have murdered Briggs and his company to claim salvage rights. Yet no evidence supported this. The court noted curious details: the ship's pump was dismantled, a deep-sounding rod was found on deck, and some water was present in the bilge. But the hull was sound, with no sign of flooding. Even so, these details hinted at something that might have alarmed the captain. The inquiry concluded with no definitive answer. The Dei Grazia crew was awarded salvage payment, though much less than expected, perhaps reflecting the lingering suspicion that foul play might have been involved. But ultimately, the Mary Celeste remained an unsolved riddle. Theories and speculation. Over the years, countless theories have been put forward to explain the fate of the Mary Celeste's crew. Some are grounded in reason, others verge on the fantastic. Let us walk through them as investigators might, sifting fact from speculation. 1. Piracy. One of the earliest suspicions was piracy. Yet this theory collapses under scrutiny. Pirates would have looted valuables, damaged the ship, or left some evidence of struggle. Instead, everything valuable, from personal belongings to the cargo itself, remained. The ship was deserted, but not plundered. 2. Mutiny. Another possibility is mutiny by the crew. Could they have turned on their captain, abandoned ship, or fled with the lifeboat? The problem lies in motive. The crew was experienced and hand-picked by Briggs himself. They left behind money, supplies, and clothing. If mutiny had occurred, why abandon a perfectly functional ship? 3. Natural disaster. The Atlantic is a restless ocean. Waterspouts, rogue waves, or sudden storms might have driven the crew into panic. Some suggest they believed the ship was sinking after water seeped into the bilges and the pumps appeared clogged. Yet when discovered, the vessel was sound and fully capable of sailing. Panic alone doesn't explain the careful lowering of the lifeboat. 4. Alcohol vapors. One of the most compelling explanations centers on the ship's cargo, industrial alcohol. It's believed that fumes may have escaped from the barrels, creating a risk of explosion. If the crew smelled vapor, they may have feared imminent danger. In haste, Captain Briggs could have ordered everyone into the lifeboat, intending to tether it to the ship until the threat passed. But perhaps the line snapped, or rough seas separated them, leaving the Mary Celeste to drift on alone. This theory gained support decades later, when experiments showed how alcohol fumes can cause invisible but frightening explosions, powerful enough to terrify but not necessarily leave burn marks. 5. Seismic or submarine activity. Others have suggested unusual natural forces, underwater earthquakes or volcanic activity in the Azores could have destabilized the sea, making the crew believe the ship was doomed. But geological records do not show significant seismic events at the time. 6. Insurance fraud or conspiracy. Some writers have speculated about deliberate abandonment, perhaps an attempt at insurance fraud. But no evidence has ever linked Winchester, Briggs, or the investors to such a plot. In fact, Briggs was a man of strong moral character, unlikely to risk his wife and child in such a scheme. 7. Paranormal theories. Inevitably, the absence of solid evidence invited more fantastic ideas, alien abductions, sea monsters, or curses. These theories persist in popular imagination but fall outside the realm of credible history. They are part of the legend, but not the solution. Legacy of the mystery. The Mary Celeste returned to service, though her reputation was forever cursed. Few sailors wished to serve aboard a ship with such a haunted legacy. She changed hands several times, carrying various cargoes across the Atlantic. Eventually, in 1885, she was deliberately wrecked off the coast of Haiti as part of an insurance scam. But it was not her end as a ghost story. The mystery of her abandoned crew never faded. Writers seized upon it, weaving tales of supernatural intervention. Arthur Conan Doyle, before creating Sherlock Holmes, wrote a fictionalized account in 1884, calling it J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement. His story exaggerated and altered facts, but it fueled worldwide fascination. Since then, the Mary Celeste has appeared in literature, film, and popular culture, a symbol of the sea's enduring enigma. A closer look at Captain Briggs. To understand the mystery, one must return to the character of Captain Briggs. He was not reckless. His letters reveal a man devoted to his family, grounded in faith, and careful in judgment. For Briggs to order an abandonment, he must have believed his family and crew were in imminent danger. Whether it was fumes, false flooding, or something unseen, his decision must have been rooted in his sense of responsibility. And yet, history records no trace of them after November 25, 1872. Not a single lifeboat fragment, no survivor, no body was ever found. The Atlantic simply absorbed them, leaving only questions. Why it endures. The story of the Mary Celeste persists not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. She was not the only ghost ship in history, but she became the most famous. Perhaps it is because her puzzle is perfectly balanced, enough facts to intrigue, enough gaps to mystify. We see a family, a crew, a voyage meant to be ordinary. We see a ship, intact and provisioned, left behind like a stage with actors vanished mid-scene.